Welcome, friend. Tonight we gently return to something simple. Not to become wiser, not to become better, not to arrive anywhere new, but to soften the quiet assumptions that shape how we see ourselves in the world. Through these stories, we will explore what it means to live with a beginner's mind, to loosen certainty, to question identity, to discover that nothing is truly fixed. We will see how striving can dissolve, how peace does not need protection, and how presence does not depend on perfect conditions. There is nothing here you must achieve, no insight you must force, no transformation you must complete before sleep arrives, just listening. At the long night, we move slowly, not to escape life, but to meet it without resistance. These stories are not instructions to follow, but invitations to notice what is already here. As you settle in, allow the day to fall away gently. There is nowhere to arrive, only this moment, and the quiet awareness that has been with you all along. In a quiet town, surrounded by low mountains and mist-covered fields, there lived a scholar named Hideo. For 40 years, Hideo had devoted his life to the study of Buddhist philosophy. His home was filled with scrolls and ancient texts collected from across the country. Wooden shelves lined every wall, sagging slightly under the weight of sutras, commentaries, and handwritten notes. Ink brushes rested beside carefully stacked manuscripts. The scent of paper and incense lingered in the air. Hideo was respected. Students traveled long distances to sit before him. He could recite entire passages from memory. The Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, each delivered with precision and clarity. He understood subtle doctrine. He could debate emptiness, no self, and enlightenment with sharp intelligence. He had sacrificed much for this knowledge. While others married and raised families, he studied. While others built wealth, he accumulated insight. While others slept, he read by lamplight. And yet, something unsettled him. Though he could explain enlightenment perfectly in words, he could not say he had tasted it. Though he could describe awakening in elegant phrases, he could not say he had awakened. There was knowledge in him, but there was no rest. One autumn evening, travelers passing through his town spoke of a Zen master who lived high in the mountains. They said this master did not lecture on doctrine. He did not debate philosophy. He rarely quoted sutras. And yet those who sat with him claimed their understanding shifted completely. He speaks very little, one traveler said, but when he does it is as if something inside you falls silent. Hideo listened with narrowed eyes. How could such a man know more than someone who had studied for 40 years? What insight could possibly exist beyond the scriptures he had already mastered? Still, the stories stirred something in him. Not admiration, not humility, but curiosity mixed with pride. Perhaps he thought, I will test this mountain monk. Perhaps I will discover whether his so-called wisdom withstands real examination. The journey took 3 days. The mountain path was steep and uneven. Hideo was not accustomed to physical hardship. His body ached. His sandals wore thin against the rocks. Blisters formed on his feet. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became. By the time he reached the wooden gates of the monastery, he was exhausted and irritable. A young monk, perhaps 16 years old, greeted him with a bow. "Welcome," the boy said gently. "You must have traveled far." Hideo nodded stiffly. "I have come to see the master." The young monk led him across a simple courtyard. Fallen leaves gathered along the edges of worn stone paths. The buildings were plain weathered wood modest roofs, no decoration, no grand statues, no elaborate halls. Hideo felt a flicker of disappointment. This was the place of great wisdom. The young monk slid open a wooden door and gestured inside. The room was small, sparse. A low wooden table stood in the center. A single cushion rested on the floor. Seated calmly near the table was an elderly man. His robes were faded. His hands were rough and scarred as if he had worked with them for many years. Deep lines traced his face, but his eyes were clear. This was Master Bankei. "Welcome," the old master said softly. "You look tired from your journey. Please sit." Hideo bowed slightly and lowered himself onto the cushion. "May I offer you tea?" the master asked. "Yes," Hideo replied. "Thank you." Master Bankei began preparing the tea with slow, deliberate movements. He rinsed the teapot with hot water. He measured the leaves carefully from a wooden container. He waited patiently as water heated over a small charcoal brazier. The room fell silent except for the gentle sound of water beginning to simmer. Hideo grew uncomfortable. He had expected immediate discussion, perhaps debate, perhaps acknowledgement of his scholarly reputation. Instead, the master seemed completely absorbed in the simple act of making tea. Unable to tolerate the silence, Hideo spoke. "I have studied Buddhist teachings for 40 years, he began. The master nodded lightly but did not interrupt. "I have read the great sutras. I understand the doctrine of emptiness. I have debated the nature of enlightenment with respected scholars across the region. Many consider me knowledgeable." The water reached the right temperature. The master poured it over the leaves. Steam rose gently. "And yet," Hideo continued, "despite all I know, I feel something is missing. I can describe awakening perfectly in theory, but I wish to understand direct experience. I have come to see whether you can offer insight beyond what I already know." The master lifted 2 small cups and placed them on the table. He began to pour the tea into Hideo's cup. The pale green liquid flowed steadily. Hideo kept speaking. He described his favorite interpretations of key texts. He explained the subtleties of various philosophical positions. He outlined his understanding of mind and reality. The tea reached the rim of the cup. The master continued pouring. The tea overflowed. It spilled over the edge and onto the tray beneath. Still, the master's hand remained steady. Tea ran across the tray and dripped onto the woven mat below. Hideo stopped mid-sentence. "Master," he exclaimed, "stop! The cup is full. It cannot hold any more. You are wasting the tea." Master Bankei gently set down the teapot. He looked at Hideo with calm, almost amused eyes. "Like this cup," he said quietly, "you are full. Full of your knowledge, full of your ideas about Buddhism, full of your conclusions." He gestured to the overflowing tea. "How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" The room fell silent. Hideo felt the words land heavily inside him. For a moment, his mind raced with defensive thoughts. He wanted to explain that his knowledge was genuine, that his study had been sincere, that he had not come merely to boast. But as he looked at the spilled tea soaking into the mat, something shifted. He realized he had not come to learn. He had come to confirm. He had come to add one more idea to his collection. He had not come to empty himself. He had come to prove himself. The cup had been full long before the tea was poured. He lowered his gaze. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I see now that I did not come here to listen. I came here to show you how much I know. Master Bankei reached for a cloth and calmly began wiping the spilled tea. There is nothing to forgive, he replied. Many people arrive with full cups. I once did as well. He wrung out the cloth and placed it aside. Your 40 years of study are not wasted. The texts you have read contain real wisdom. But knowing about wisdom is not the same as living it. He looked directly at Hideo. A map is not the territory. You have studied maps for many years. Perhaps now you are ready to walk the land itself. Hideo sat in silence. For the first time in decades, he did not know what to say. And in that, not knowing, something began. The silence in the small room did not feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt vast. Hideo sat with his hands resting on his knees, his eyes lowered toward the woven mat where tea had soaked into the fibers. The stain spread outward in a dark circle, irregular, unplanned. He could not remember the last time he had been without words. For decades, language had been his strength. When challenged, he responded with quotations. When uncertain, he assembled arguments. When praised, he accepted it with composed humility. Words had been both his armor and his identity. But now sitting across from this old mountain monk, words felt heavy, inadequate. Master Bankei poured tea into his own cup this time, stopping before it reached the rim. He lifted it slowly and took a small sip. "Tell me," the master said gently, "when you were a young student, before you had read so many books, what brought you to the path?" The question surprised Hideo. He searched his memory. "I wanted to understand suffering," he replied after a long pause. "My father died when I was young. I saw how fragile everything was. I wanted something solid, something true." "And did you find it in the books?" the master asked. Hideo hesitated. "I found explanations," he admitted. "I found teachings about impermanence, emptiness, no self. I understood them intellectually. They made sense. But did they bring you rest?" The question landed softly, but it cut deeply. Hideo looked down again. "No," he said quietly. Master Bankei nodded as if this answer was neither surprising nor disappointing. "When your father died," he continued, "did you open a book?" "No." "What did you do?" "I cried." The master smiled gently. That was closer to truth than many commentaries. Hideo felt a flicker of resistance. Was the master dismissing scholarship? Was he suggesting study had no value? As if sensing his thought, Bankei continued, "Study is not the problem. Knowledge is not the enemy. But when knowledge becomes something we cling to, something we hide behind, it prevents us from meeting life directly." He placed his cup down carefully. "You said you wanted to understand direct experience, but direct experience cannot be collected like scrolls. It cannot be mastered through debate. It can only be lived." Hideo listened without interruption. For the first time, he was not preparing a reply. The master leaned forward slightly. "Right now," he said, "what are you experiencing?" Hideo blinked. He turned his attention inward. He noticed the tightness in his chest, the lingering fatigue from the climb, the faint scent of tea in the air, the coolness of the mountain breeze entering through the open window, the sound of wind brushing against leaves outside. "I feel unsettled," he said slowly, "and also lighter." "Good," the master replied. "Do not analyze it. Do not label it. Simply feel it." They sat together in silence. Minutes passed. Hideo noticed thoughts arising automatically, interpretations, comparisons, attempts to turn the moment into understanding. But each time he returned to the simple sensations present right now. The ache in his feet, the warmth of tea in his hands, the sound of his own breathing. Nothing mystical, and yet something in him softened. For 40 years he had been trying to climb toward enlightenment, through effort, through accumulation, through adding more and more to himself. Now he glimpsed another possibility. What if awakening was not something to acquire, but something revealed when nothing was being added? The master spoke again. When a cup is empty, he said, it is not useless, it is ready. How do I empty my cup? Hideo asked. Bankei chuckled softly. You already began when you admitted you did not come here to listen. He stood slowly and walked to the doorway, gesturing for Hideo to follow. Outside, the courtyard lay quiet beneath drifting clouds. A few monks swept fallen leaves into small piles. One carried water from a well, another chopped wood beside the wall. Look, the master said. Hideo watched. The monks moved without hurry. There was no display of wisdom, no performance, only sweeping, only carrying water, only chopping wood. They are not thinking about enlightenment, Bankei continued. They are simply here. The wind scattered a few leaves that had just been gathered. A young monk paused, then calmly began sweeping them again. No frustration, no complaint, just sweeping. Hideo felt tears rise unexpectedly. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps relief, or perhaps the sudden recognition that he had spent decades chasing something that had never been absent. Stay here for a while, Bankei said gently, not to collect more ideas, but to practice emptying. That night, Hideo lay on a simple mat in a bare cell. No scrolls, no books, only the sound of wind moving through the mountains. Thoughts tried to reconstruct the day into theory. He let them pass. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself not to understand. And in that quiet not knowing, his cup began very gently to empty. Emptying the cup is not a dramatic act. It does not require burning books. It does not require abandoning everything we have learned. It does not demand that we become someone else. It begins much more quietly. It begins the moment we realize that knowing about something is not the same as meeting it. Hideo had spent 40 years studying the teachings of awakening, yet he had never truly met the present moment without filtering it through knowledge, and this is where the deeper practice of beginner's mind unfolds. Once the cup begins to empty, we must learn how to see again. Not through concepts, not through memory, not through habit, but directly. There is a difference between knowing what something is and actually encountering it. We may know everything about wood, its grain, its density, its proper use, but still never truly see the piece of timber resting in our hands. We may understand philosophy in flawless language, but still never feel the wind moving across our skin. Beginner's mind does not reject skill, it refines it, it softens it. It allows knowledge to serve attention, rather than replace it. And sometimes the lesson does not come from a monastery. Sometimes it comes from a piece of wood, held in the hands of someone who thought he had already mastered his craft. Let us continue. In a village known for its skilled craftsmen, there lived a young carpenter named Anjo. For 7 years, Anjo had trained under one of the most respected builders in the region. His apprenticeship had been strict and demanding. He rose before dawn, He practiced until his hands were blistered. He studied the grain of wood, the balance of structures, the precision of joints that required no nails. By the time his training ended, he could cut dovetail joints so cleanly that they slid together without force. He could select timber by sound alone, tapping a plank lightly and listening for hidden weakness. He knew how to follow traditional proportions that had been passed down for generations. He had earned his title, and he was proud of it. Other young men in the village looked to him with admiration. When a beam needed fitting or a door frame required careful alignment, Anjo was often called first. His movements were efficient. His decisions were confident. He knew wood, or at least he believed he did. One spring, the village elders decided to build a new meditation hall beside the temple. It would not be large or ornate, just a simple structure where villagers could gather in silence during the early morning hours. Anjo volunteered immediately. This would be his opportunity to demonstrate everything he had learned. On the first morning of construction, he arrived before sunrise. Mist hovered above the open field where the hall would stand. Stacks of timber lay neatly arranged beside the foundation stones. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air. Anjo walked among the materials with a critical eye. This beam will need trimming, he thought. That plank should be used for interior walls. The support posts must be chosen carefully. He had plans already forming in his mind. Soon the other carpenters arrived. Among them was an elderly man named Saburo. Saburo had been building in the village for over 50 years. His back was slightly bent, his hands thick and scarred from decades of labor. He moved slowly, but there was nothing uncertain about his movements. "Good morning, Elder," Anjo said respectfully. "Good morning," Saburo replied with a quiet smile. "You seem eager. We should begin with the main beams," Anjo said. "If we measure carefully, we can avoid unnecessary waste." Saburo nodded but did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward a stack of pine boards and selected one at random. It was rough, perhaps 2 feet long, still showing saw marks along its edges. He handed it to Anjo. "Tell me about this piece of wood," Saburo said. Anjo examined it quickly. "It is pine," he replied confidently. "Lightweight, easy to shape, suitable for interior structure, but not ideal for load-bearing beams. The grain runs fairly straight. There are no visible cracks. It should serve well." Saburo nodded. "Very good. Your training was thorough." He paused. "Now, sit with it." Anjo blinked. "Sit with it. Yes, sit on that stone and simply hold it." Anjo felt a flicker of confusion and irritation. There was work to be done, measurements to take, tasks to begin. The sun was rising. Time was passing. "What should I look for?" he asked. Saburo smiled faintly. "Do not look for anything. Just sit with it." Though he did not understand, Anjo respected the elder too much to refuse. He walked to a large flat stone at the edge of the work site and sat down, the pine board resting across his palms. At first, his mind filled with everything he already knew about pine. He mentally reviewed its properties. He considered where it would fit in the design. He calculated how it might best be cut. This was how he had been trained to think efficiently, decisively. But Saburo had said not to look for anything. So after a few moments, Anjo allowed his thoughts to settle. He shifted his attention from knowledge to direct perception. The wood was lighter than he expected. He ran his thumb along its surface and felt the fine ridges left by the saw blade. Tiny splinters caught against his skin. The scent was faint but fresh, carrying a trace of resin and forest air. He turned it over slowly. A small knot rested near one end. The grain curved around it in a tight spiral, like water flowing around a stone in a stream. He had seen knots countless times before, but he had never studied one so closely. The pattern was intricate, almost beautiful. Sunlight began to break through the mist, striking the board at an angle. The pale surface shifted in tone, revealing subtle shades of cream gold and amber he had never noticed. He felt something unexpected: curiosity. This was not pine in general. This was this piece. This tree had grown in a particular place through particular seasons of rain and drought. The rings hidden beneath the surface recorded years of weather he had never witnessed. The board in his hands carried a history. He had worked with thousands of pieces of wood during his apprenticeship. But had he ever truly met one? Footsteps approached. Saburo lowered himself carefully onto the stone beside him. "What do you see?" the elder asked. Anjo did not answer immediately. "I see that I have never really looked at wood before," he said quietly. Saburo raised an eyebrow slightly. "Explain." "I have always seen what I was trained to see: strength, weakness, suitability, use. But I have never simply seen the wood itself." He turned the board once more in his hands. "This is not just pine. It is this tree, this moment, this pattern." Saburo nodded slowly. "When we think we already know something," he said, "we stop meeting it." The sounds of construction continued behind them. Hammers tapping, voices measuring distances, wood being shifted into place. But Anjo remained seated. For the first time since completing his apprenticeship, he was not trying to prove his competence. He was simply paying attention. And in that quiet attention, something in his certainty began to loosen. Saburo remained seated beside Anjo for a while longer, saying nothing. The morning light grew warmer. The mist slowly lifted from the field. Around them, the other carpenters had already begun measuring beams and setting foundations into place. Anjo felt a familiar impulse rising within him, the urge to stand up, to demonstrate efficiency, to reassert his competence. He was not accustomed to sitting still while others worked. But Saburo spoke before he could move. "When you hold the wood like this," the old carpenter said quietly, "what happens inside you?" Anjo searched for the right words. "I feel slower," he admitted. "Less certain," Saburo nodded. "Good. Certainty can be useful, but when it becomes too solid, it blinds us." He reached over and ran his fingers lightly across the board in Anjo's hands. "Your training taught you categories: pine, oak, load-bearing, decorative, interior, exterior. These are useful. But the wood does not experience itself as a category. It simply grows." Anjo listened carefully. "If you approach every piece of timber as pine in general," Saburo continued, "you will miss what makes this one different from all others." The old man gestured toward the stack of lumber. "Look at them. They appear similar, but each carries its own history. One may have grown on the edge of the forest where wind bent it year after year. Another may have grown in shade, stretching toward light. The grain tells the story if you learn to see it." Anjo felt something subtle unfolding inside him. For 7 years he had trained to master wood, but mastery, he now realized, had quietly turned into assumption. He had stopped looking. Saburo stood slowly and motioned for Anjo to follow. They walked toward the area where the foundation posts would be set. Several thick beams lay side by side. "Choose one for the main support," Saburo said. Anjo stepped forward confidently. His hand hovered above the timber as his trained mind evaluated straightness, density, visible flaws. But then he paused. He remembered the feeling of the small board in his hands. Instead of deciding quickly, he knelt. He placed both palms on the first beam and closed his eyes briefly. He felt its weight, its slight curvature, the way one edge was denser than the other. He moved to the next beam, then the next. The other carpenters watched with mild curiosity. Anjo was taking far longer than usual. Finally, he rested his hand on one particular beam. "This one," he said quietly. Saburo tilted his head. "Why?" Anjo opened his eyes. "It is not the straightest," he admitted, "but its grain is tight and consistent through the center. It feels steady." Saburo smiled faintly. "You felt it instead of deciding it." Together they lifted the beam into place. As they worked through the day, Saburo offered few instructions. Instead, he asked questions. "What does this joint need? How does this piece want to rest? What happens if you stop forcing it?" Each question slowed Anjo's usual rhythm. He began noticing small details he would have once overlooked, the slight resistance in a joint that suggested hidden tension in the wood, the way a beam settled more naturally when rotated slightly, the sound a plank made when it fit correctly. Work that once felt mechanical now required presence. At midday, as they rested beneath the shade of an old tree, Anjo spoke. "All these years," he said softly, "I believed skill meant certainty." Saburo chewed thoughtfully on a piece of rice before replying. "Skill begins with certainty," he said, "but if it ends there, it becomes rigid. True mastery remains curious." Anjo considered this. He remembered how proud he had felt after finishing his apprenticeship, how eager he had been to prove himself, how quickly he judged others' work by the standards he had learned. He had believed he was seeing clearly. Now he saw how much of his vision had been filtered by what he thought he already knew. In the following weeks, the meditation hall slowly took shape. Anjo worked differently. Before cutting any board, he paused. Before fitting any joint, he listened. Before correcting what appeared to be an imperfection, he asked whether it was truly a flaw or simply something unexpected. Sometimes, what he would once have forced into perfect symmetry revealed a more natural balance when left slightly irregular. Sometimes a beam he might have discarded showed unexpected strength when positioned thoughtfully. The building began to feel less like something imposed upon the land and more like something growing from it. When the hall was finally completed months later, the villagers gathered to admire it. It was simple, unadorned, quiet. Yet there was something unmistakably harmonious about it. The proportions felt natural. The beams seemed at ease in their positions. Light entered through the windows in a way that felt intentional, yet effortless. The head priest approached Anjo. "Your work has deepened," he said gently. "There is a tension in these walls." Anjo bowed. He did not feel pride this time. He felt gratitude. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Anjo sat alone inside the finished hall. The scent of fresh wood filled the air. He ran his hand along one of the beams, not to evaluate it, not to measure it, but simply to feel it. For the first time in his life, he understood something beyond technique. Knowing about wood was not the same as meeting wood. Knowledge had given him tools. Attention had given him relationship, and in that relationship, his work became alive. Emptying the cup teaches us to release what we cling to. Listening to the wood teaches us to meet what is in our hands. But there is another subtle veil that still remains. Even when we are no longer clinging to knowledge, even when we slow down enough to pay attention, we may still be seeing through memory. We walk the same path each morning. We sit in the same room. We pass the same trees, the same walls, the same faces. And because we have seen them before, we stop truly seeing them. The mind in its efficiency replaces reality with familiarity. It says, "I know this already," and in that quiet sentence, the world fades into repetition. But nothing is ever truly repeated. The light changes, the air shifts. The person across from us is no longer the person they were yesterday. Even we are not the same. Beginner's mind is not only about letting go of what we know, it is about learning to see what is already here, as if for the first time. Sometimes it takes something very small to awaken us, a shift in light, a drop of rain, a pause in our habitual thinking, and suddenly the familiar becomes alive again. There was once a calligrapher who had walked through his garden for 30 years, and one morning after the rain, he truly saw it. Let us continue. For more than 30 years, the calligrapher Makoto had followed the same morning ritual. Before sunrise, he would rise from his futon, wash his face in cool water, and sit before his low wooden table. A single candle flickered beside his inkstone. Outside, the world was still quiet. Inside, only the soft grinding of ink against stone could be heard. For 2 hours each morning, he practiced. Characters flowed from his brush in disciplined strokes, balanced, controlled, refined. His lines were admired throughout the region. Temples displayed his work. Wealthy families commissioned scrolls bearing his elegant script. Makoto's technique was beyond question. After practice, he always walked through the small garden behind his home, on the way to the well where he cleaned his brushes. The garden was simple. A narrow stone path curved gently between moss-covered rocks. A small pond reflected the sky. Several old pine trees leaned slightly with age. In spring, low blossoms appeared near the edges of the path. In autumn, leaves gathered in quiet corners. He had walked this path thousands of times. In morning light, in afternoon heat, in winter frost, in summer rain. His feet knew where to step without thought. His eyes barely glanced at what surrounded him. As he walked, his mind moved elsewhere, reviewing upcoming commissions, replaying conversations, considering improvements to his technique. The garden was background, familiar, known. One night, heavy rain fell across the village. The sound had continued for hours, tapping steadily against Makoto's roof. He listened absently as he drifted to sleep, thinking only that the air would be clean in the morning. When dawn arrived, the rain had stopped. Makoto completed his calligraphy practice as usual. His brush moved smoothly. His strokes were precise. He stood, gathered his brushes, and slid open the door leading to the garden. The air that met him was cool and fresh. The scent of wet earth rose softly around him. He stepped onto the stone path, and for reasons he could not explain, he stopped. The garden looked different. Or perhaps he realized slowly he was looking differently. Water droplets clung to every surface. They rested along pine needles like rows of tiny glass beads. They gathered along the edges of leaves. They pooled in shallow depressions in the stone path. The rising sun broke through scattered clouds, and light touched those droplets. Suddenly, the entire garden shimmered. Each droplet caught the light and fractured it into miniature rainbows. The pine tree he had passed for 3 decades now appeared alive with thousands of trembling points of brightness. Makoto felt his breath slow. He had seen this tree every day for 30 years, but he had never seen this. He stepped closer. The bark was darker where it had absorbed rain. Tiny streams of water traced faint lines down its surface. Moss at the base of the trunk glowed a vivid green he had never noticed before. Had it always been this green? He knelt beside a flat stone near the pond. The moss there appeared almost luminous, saturated with moisture. Each tiny cluster held droplets at its tips, magnifying its texture. Makoto leaned forward and looked closer. For a moment, he forgot about time. He forgot about commissions waiting to be completed. He forgot about reputation. He forgot even about being a calligrapher. There was only color, light, texture. He moved toward the pond. The water's surface was still reflecting both sky and tree branches above. But beneath the reflection, smooth stones lay visible through the clear water. Surface, depth, reflection, 3 layers existing at once. He had passed this pond thousands of times. He could not remember the last time he had truly seen it. He watched as a single droplet fell from a branch and touched the water. Concentric ripples moved outward, briefly distorting the reflection of the sky before settling again into stillness. So simple, so ordinary. And yet something inside him felt as though it had just awakened. He began to walk more slowly through the garden. The small crack in one stone held a shallow line of water. An insect paused at its edge to drink. The curve of a pine branch seemed more deliberate than he had ever noticed. Even the air felt different. Not merely cool, but textured, layered with scent and softness. Makoto realized something unsettling. The garden had always changed. The light was never exactly the same. The air was never identical. Leaves shifted daily. Moss grew quietly over time. But he had stopped seeing. He had replaced direct perception with memory. Instead of meeting the garden each morning, he had been walking through his idea of the garden. His mind had whispered, "I know this already." And so he had not truly looked. He sat down on a low stone bench and remained there. Minutes passed, then more. The garden did not become extraordinary. It did not transform into something dramatic. It simply revealed what had always been present. Movement in stillness, color in simplicity, change within what appeared constant. Makoto felt a quiet humility rise in him. He who was praised for his attention to detail in calligraphy had been blind in his own backyard. How many other parts of his life had become invisible because of familiarity? How many faces did he see without seeing? How many mornings did he greet without greeting? The sun rose higher and the droplets began to evaporate. The shimmering brilliance faded, but something remained. An awareness. The garden was not new, but this moment was. And for the first time in many years, Makoto understood that seeing freshly was not about finding something different. It was about meeting what is already here without the veil of assumption. He stood slowly carrying his brushes toward the well. But this time, each step felt deliberate. Each breath felt known, and the path he had walked for 30 years felt as though he had never walked it before. Makoto washed his brushes at the well with unusual care. He noticed the way the ink dissolved into the water, dark clouds swirling, thinning, disappearing. He noticed the temperature of the water against his fingers, the faint metallic scent of the bucket. Even the sound of bristles against wood felt distinct. Nothing in the task had changed, but he was no longer absent from it. When he returned to his work table, he did not immediately begin another commission. Instead, he sat. The blank paper lay before him. For many years, blank paper had represented potential achievement, another opportunity to demonstrate refinement and mastery. Today it felt different. It felt alive. He lifted his brush and paused. Normally, before beginning, he would recall the proper proportions of each character. He would picture the ideal stroke order in his mind. He would summon technique. But that morning, something in him resisted returning to habit. He dipped the brush into ink and allowed his hand to move without rehearsing the outcome. The first stroke emerged slower than usual. He watched it form. He noticed how the ink thickened slightly at the beginning, how the fibers of the paper absorbed it unevenly, how the brush hesitated for a fraction of a second before completing its arc. He did not correct it. He did not compare it. He simply saw it. The second stroke followed. This time he felt the subtle tremor in his hand, not from weakness but from attention. He was no longer executing a memory of a character. He was discovering it. Line by line, the character appeared on the page. It was not flawed, but it was not mechanical either. There was space within it, breath within it, a quality of immediacy that had been absent before. Makoto leaned back slightly and looked at what he had written. For decades, he had produced characters that were technically flawless, balanced, controlled, predictable. This one was different. It felt present, not perfected by memory, but born in this moment. He realized something quietly profound. He had mistaken familiarity for understanding. Because he had written these characters thousands of times, he believed he knew them completely. But the character he wrote today was not the character he wrote yesterday. The pressure of his hand was different. The humidity of the air was different. The subtle rhythm of his breath was different. Even he was different. The world was not repeating itself. It was renewing itself. He stood and returned to the garden once more. The sunlight had grown stronger. Many of the droplets had already vanished. The shimmering brilliance of earlier had softened into ordinary light. And yet, he did not feel disappointed, because he understood now that what he had seen was not a rare event. It had always been happening. Rain would fall again. Light would shift again. The moss would change shade again. Each day was not repetition. It was variation. He thought of the many mornings he had rushed through this path, planning, remembering, anticipating, living in thoughts about life, rather than in life itself. How much beauty had passed unrecognized. How many small miracles had gone unnoticed because he had already decided he knew what was there. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of a distant bell from the temple. Makoto closed his eyes for a moment. He did not try to interpret the moment. He did not try to turn it into insight. He simply allowed it. When he opened his eyes, the garden was no longer a backdrop to his thoughts. It was immediate, alive. He understood then that beginner's mind was not about ignorance, It was about removing the layer of assumption that dulls perception. It was about meeting each moment without saying, "I've seen this before," because in truth, he had not. No sunrise repeats itself. No breath repeats itself. No person remains exactly as they were. From that day forward, Makoto walked his garden differently. He did not force himself to feel wonder. He did not demand novelty. He simply remembered to look. When he met neighbors in the street, he noticed subtle shifts in their expressions. When he drank tea, he tasted it fully. When he listened to students, he heard not only their words, but the spaces between them. His calligraphy changed as well. Students remarked that his work seemed lighter, more spacious. He smiled when they said this. Nothing had changed in his training, everything had changed in his seeing, and he came to understand something deeply simple. The world does not grow dull, we grow inattentive. When attention returns, life begins again. Seeing freshly changes how the world appears. But what happens when life is not extraordinary? What happens when there is no rain glistening on pine needles, no sudden shimmer of light, no moment dramatic enough to awaken us? Most of our lives are not made of rare beauty. They are made of repetition. The same bowl, the same kitchen, the same path from room to room, the same hands performing the same tasks day after day. And repetition is where attention quietly falls asleep. We believe we know the taste of rice. We believe we know the sound of boiling water. We believe we know what tomorrow morning will feel like. So we stop looking. But repetition does not mean sameness. Even in the most ordinary tasks, something new is unfolding. The rice has never been washed in this exact water before. The steam has never risen in quite this way. The hands preparing the meal are not the same hands they were yesterday. Fresh seeing is not reserved for gardens after rain. It must enter the kitchen. It must enter the chores. It must enter the simple work we think we have already mastered. There was once a cook in a mountain monastery who had prepared the same meals for 20 years. Rice, vegetables, soup 3 times a day, year after year. She believed she knew her work completely, until one morning a young monk showed her that she had gone blind, not from darkness, but from familiarity. Let us continue. In the mountain monastery, where Master Bankei once trained as a young monk, there was a kitchen that never rested. Before dawn, while most of the monks still slept beneath thin blankets, a small lantern would already be glowing near the stove. That lantern belonged to Oshin. For 20 years, Oshin had been the cook of the monastery. She had arrived as a young widow with nowhere else to go. The abbot had allowed her to stay in exchange for preparing meals. At first, she had worked with quiet gratitude. Each bowl of rice she washed felt like a gift of stability. Each pot of soup she stirred felt like a small prayer. But years passed, morning after morning, midday after midday, evening after evening, rice, vegetables, soup. The rhythm never changed. Her hands moved efficiently. She knew exactly how much water to add without measuring. She could slice carrots to uniform thickness without looking directly at the blade. She could judge the fire's temperature by sound alone. The younger monks admired her skill. "Sister Ocean's rice is always perfect," they would whisper. And it was. Never undercooked, never burnt, never late. But something subtle had shifted inside her over the years. The work that once felt sacred had become automatic. When she rinsed rice, She was thinking about the next task. When she chopped vegetables, her mind wandered to conversations from the day before. When she stirred soup, she replayed old memories or planned for tomorrow. Her hands were present. Her mind was elsewhere. One early autumn morning, a new novice arrived at the monastery. His name was Jiro. He was young, perhaps 16, with eyes that seemed too curious for monastic life. Everything fascinated him. The bell that mocked meditation, ours the sound of sandals against stone, even the way steam rose from tea bowls. On his second day, he was assigned to assist Oshin in the kitchen. "Rise before the others," the head monk instructed him, "and do exactly as she says." Jiro bowed deeply. The next morning, before the sky had lightened, he entered the kitchen quietly. Oshin was already there, measuring rice into a wooden bowl. "You are the novice," she said without turning. "Yes," Jiro replied softly. "Good. Wash the rice 3 times. Gently. Do not rush." Jiro knelt beside the basin and poured water over the grains. He placed his hands into the bowl. The rice felt cool and smooth beneath his fingers. The water turned cloudy as he swirled it. He paused. Oshin glanced at him. "Why have you stopped?" "It feels like small stones," Jiro said quietly. Oshin frowned slightly. "Rice is not stones. Wash it." "Yes," he replied. But as he continued, he watched the water more closely. "The water becomes white," he said. "Because of starch," Oshin answered automatically. "It looks like mist," Jiro added. Oshin did not respond. She moved to the stove and began preparing the morning soup. Carrots met the blade in steady rhythm. Chop, chop, chop. Jiro finished rinsing the rice and carried the bowl to her. "Is this enough water?" he asked. Oshin barely looked. "Yes, place it on the fire." He did as instructed. As the pot began to warm, he leaned closer. "It makes a different sound before it boils," he observed. Oshin paused for just a fraction of a second. She had always listened for that sound, but she had not truly heard it in years. "You talk too much," she said lightly, though without harshness. Jiro smiled and stepped back. Later, as they prepared vegetables, he lifted a slice of carrot toward the light. "It is brighter at the center," he murmured. "Of course it is," Oshin replied. "That is how carrots are." Jiro tilted his head. "Has it always been this bright?" The question lingered strangely in the air. Oshin almost laughed. What kind of question was that carrots were carrots? Rice was rice. Soup was soup. But something in the boy's tone unsettled her. Not because he was wrong, but because he was seeing. When the rice finished cooking, steam rose in soft clouds from beneath the lid. Jiro lifted it carefully. "It smells sweet," he said. Oshin inhaled automatically. Rice had a smell. She knew this. But had she noticed it this morning? Had she tasted it yesterday or the day before? For years, she had trusted her experience, trusted her routine, trusted her certainty that she knew exactly how things were. She had not been careless, but she had not been present. As they served breakfast to the monks, Oshin watched Jiro from the corner of her eye. He carried each bowl carefully, as if it were fragile porcelain rather than simple wood. He placed them down gently, observing the way steam curled upward before fading. After the meal, when most monks had left for their morning duties, Oshin remained behind in the empty kitchen. She picked up a spoon and dipped it into the remaining rice. She lifted it to her mouth. For a long moment, she simply held it there. Then she tasted. Not quickly, not absent-mindedly, but as if tasting rice for the first time. There was warmth. There was subtle sweetness. There was texture she could feel against her tongue. She closed her eyes. For 20 years she had prepared this meal. How many of those years had she truly tasted it? She opened her eyes slowly. Across the kitchen, morning light entered through a small window, illuminating particles of steam drifting in the air. Nothing in the kitchen had changed. The same stove, the same pots, the same rhythm. And yet something had shifted. It was not the rice that had grown dull. It was her attention that had faded. Jiro returned from cleaning the courtyard. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Ocean looked at him quietly. "No," she said. Then after a pause, she added, "Today we will wash the rice more slowly." The next morning, Ocean rose even earlier than usual. The lantern in the kitchen flickered softly as she entered. For a moment, she did not move. She simply stood in the doorway and listened. The faint crackle of embers from the previous night. The distant rustle of wind along the monastery walls. The quiet hum of a place not yet awake. For 20 years, she had walked into this kitchen with purpose, already thinking of quantities, timing, efficiency. Today, she walked in with curiosity. She placed her hands on the wooden table. The surface felt slightly rough beneath her palms. Small grooves and scratches marked years of chopping and kneading. She traced one of the deeper cuts with her fingertip and realized she did not remember when it had been made. How many mornings had she rushed past this table without truly touching it? Jiro entered quietly and bowed. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Ocean replied. Her voice was softer than usual. "Today," she said, "we will begin with the vegetables." Jiro nodded and brought a basket of carrots and greens to the table. Ocean lifted one carrot and held it up to the light. Its surface was slightly uneven. A thin root hair clung stubbornly near its tip. Tiny specks of soil still rested in shallow creases. She turned it slowly in her hand. For years, she had seen vegetables only in terms of preparation, peel, slice, cook. Now she saw growth. This carrot had pushed through earth. It had absorbed rain. It had bent toward sunlight. It had existed long before it reached her hands. She handed it to Jiro. "What do you see?" she asked. He smiled. "Orange," he said playfully. She almost laughed. "Look again." He grew quiet and studied it more carefully. "Lines," he said, "and small cracks." "Yes." They began slicing together. Chop, pause, chop. The rhythm felt different. Instead of cutting as quickly as possible, Ocean allowed each motion to complete itself. She noticed the resistance of the blade, the crisp sound as the carrot separated cleanly, the faint scent released with each slice. Steam rose as water began to heat on the stove. She watched it for a long moment. Steam had always been there. Every morning it had curled upward in soft white strands before dissolving into air. She had used it as a signal: the rice is ready, the soup is warming. But she had not watched it. Now she did. The steam moved unpredictably. It swayed with invisible currents. It appeared solid for a breath, then vanished completely. So much like thought, she realized. Rising, forming, dissolving. "Why are you smiling?" Jiro asked. Ocean blinked, surprised. "Am I?" "Yes," he said. She turned back to the stove. "I think," she replied slowly, "I have been cooking from memory." Jiro tilted his head. "Is that wrong?" "Not wrong," she said, "but incomplete." She lifted the lid from the rice pot. The familiar cloud of steam rose toward her face. Instead of leaning away as she usually did, she remained still and allowed the warmth to touch her skin. She inhaled deeply. There it was, the subtle sweetness she had rediscovered the day before. But there was more. A softness, a warmth that spread gently through her chest. It was not the rice alone, it was a tension. Later that morning during the meal, several monks glanced at one another quietly. "The soup tastes different," one whispered. "Does it?" Another replied. It was made from the same ingredients, the same proportions, the same fire, and yet something felt warmer. After breakfast, the head monk approached Ocean. "You seem lighter," he observed. She bowed. "I am cooking more slowly," she said. He studied her face. "Then continue." Days passed. Nothing dramatic occurred. No visions, no revelations, only repetition. But the repetition had changed. Washing rice became the washing of this rice. Chopping vegetables became the cutting of this carrot. Stirring soup became the meeting of this moment. Jiro continued assisting her, though now he spoke less. He did not need to point out brightness or texture anymore. Ocean was seeing for herself. One evening, as the last bowls were stacked and the kitchen grew quiet, she sat alone beside the dying fire. She listened to the faint crackle of wood turning to ash. 20 years of routine had not been empty, but much of it had been unconscious. She understood now that meaning is not lost in repetition. Meaning fades when attention fades. The rice had never stopped being fragrant. The steam had never stopped rising beautifully. The vegetables had never stopped carrying sunlight within them. She had simply stopped tasting. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from regret, but from tenderness. So many moments had passed unseen, and yet this moment was here, alive. She bowed toward the quiet kitchen. Tomorrow she would wake again before dawn. She would light the lantern. She would wash rice. She would chop vegetables. Nothing extraordinary, and everything sacred. To empty the cup is to release certainty. To listen to the wood is to soften mastery. To see the garden is to remove the veil of memory. To taste the rice is to awaken within repetition. And yet there is something even more subtle. Even when we are attentive, even when we are present, we still carry a quiet illusion. We believe life repeats itself. We say, "It's just another day." We say, "I've walked this road before." We say, "Tomorrow will be the same." But no step is ever repeated. The road shifts beneath rain and sun. The body that walks it changes with every breath. The sky above is never arranged in quite the same way. We assume continuity. Reality unfolds as change. Beginner's mind does not only refresh perception, it reveals impermanence hidden inside routine. Sometimes the teaching comes not from a kitchen, not from a garden, but from a path walked so many times that it has become invisible. There was once a traveler who believed he knew the mountain road by heart. He had walked it in youth. He had walked it in strength. He had walked it in certainty. But one day the road showed him that it had never been the same twice. And in seeing that, he discovered that he had never been the same twice either. Let us continue. For most of his life, Haru believed he understood the mountain road. He had grown up in a small village, nestled between two ridges of forested hills. The road that wound between them was not large or impressive. It was little more than packed earth and scattered stone, curving gently upward toward a temple that rested near the summit. As a boy, Haru had run along that path barefoot, chasing friends and dragonflies. As a young man, he had climbed it with ambition in his chest, determined to leave the village and prove himself in the city beyond the mountains. And later, when life in the city became heavier than he expected, he had walked it again, this time slowly carrying disappointment in silence. He believed he knew every bend, every exposed root, every stone that shifted beneath careless feet. "This road has not changed," he once said to a childhood friend. "I could walk it in darkness," and perhaps he could. But knowing the shape of a path is not the same as knowing the moment you are walking in. One late afternoon in early winter, Haru found himself at the base of that same mountain road again. He was no longer young. Threads of gray had begun to appear at his temples. His shoulders carried the quiet fatigue of years lived earnestly imperfectly. He had returned to the village to care for his aging mother. The city had given him skill and hardship in equal measure, but not the clarity he once expected it would. The temple at the summit had always offered him a sense of perspective. When life felt uncertain, he would climb there and sit beneath the tall cedar trees. And so, without much thought, he began walking. The air was colder than he remembered. Dry leaves crunched beneath his sandals. The scent of pine lingered faintly in the wind. At first his mind wandered, as it always had on this path. He replayed conversations from the city. He reconsidered choices. He imagined alternate versions of his life, what might have been if he had spoken differently, chosen differently, stayed or left sooner. His body moved automatically. Left foot, right foot, the familiar rhythm of ascent. After several minutes, he reached a bend in the road where a large stone jutted slightly from the earth. As a boy, he had leapt from that stone, dramatically pretending it was the edge of a cliff. As a young man, he had barely noticed it. Now he slowed. The stone seemed smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps he was larger. He stood still for a moment, looking at it. Its surface was smoother than in his memory. Moss had grown along one edge. A small crack ran down its side that he did not recall seeing before. Had it always been there? He touched it lightly with his fingers. It felt cool, solid, present. He continued walking. A little farther up the path, he noticed that a section of earth had eroded slightly, exposing tangled roots beneath. He did not remember this either. The road, he realized, was not fixed. Rain had shaped it. Wind had shifted it. Time had pressed upon it. He walked more slowly. The forest sounded different from his childhood memory. Fewer birds called at this hour. The trees seemed taller. Or perhaps he was noticing their height for the first time. A gust of wind moved through the branches, scattering a small spiral of leaves across the path. Haru stopped again. He had walked this road dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. Yet something about this ascent felt unfamiliar. Or perhaps it was not the road that was unfamiliar. Perhaps it was him. He became aware of his breathing. It was heavier than when he was young. His knees felt the incline more sharply. The pace that once felt effortless now required intention. The road had not become steeper. His body had changed. He laughed softly to himself. "I thought I knew this road," he murmured. But what did it mean to know something that never remained the same? He resumed walking, this time without drifting into memory. He let the present moment lead. The way sunlight filtered through branches was not identical to any previous climb. The pattern of shadows across the path shifted with each step. Even the silence was textured, layered with distant sounds he had never bothered to separate before. Halfway up the mountain, he encountered an old wooden sign marking the remaining distance to the temple. He had passed that sign so often he no longer read it. Today, he paused. The paint had faded unevenly. One corner of the wood had splintered. Tiny insects moved in and out of cracks he had never noticed. The sign, like the stone below, carried history. But it was not frozen in that history. It was aging, just as he was. Haru felt something loosen inside him. He had spent much of his life wishing things would remain stable, that youth would linger, that decisions would not carry consequence, that relationships would not shift. He had walked this road, believing it was a constant in a changing world. But now he saw the truth more clearly. The road was changing too, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, continuously, just as he was. The path ahead curved gently out of sight. For the first time since beginning the climb, Haru felt no urgency to reach the summit. The walking itself felt sufficient. Each step was not a repetition of the last. It was its own moment, its own contact between foot and earth, its own meeting of breath and air. He realized that the illusion of sameness had never belonged to the road. It had belonged to his mind. His mind had said, "I have been here before." And in that sentence, it had stopped paying attention. Now, as he climbed higher into the thinning light of late afternoon, he let go of that sentence. The road was not the same. He was not the same. This moment was not a continuation of yesterday. It was new, and he was finally walking it. By the time Haru reached the final stretch of the mountain path, the sky had begun to soften into evening. The air thinned slightly at this height. The scent of cedar deepened. The temple roof appeared between branches, familiar in outline, yet somehow distant. He slowed even more. In the past, he had always climbed with purpose. As a boy, he raced to the top. As a young man, he climbed to clear his thoughts. Even in disappointment, he had walked quickly, hoping the temple would offer answers. Today, he did not climb for answers. He climbed because he was climbing. The final incline was steeper than the lower portion of the road. His breathing grew steady but heavy. Inhale, exhale. Each breath felt tangible. He noticed the subtle pause between them, the space where the body rested for a fraction of a second before beginning again. He had breathed this way his entire life. Yet he could not remember the last time he had truly felt a single breath from beginning to end. A thought arose. If even a breath has never repeated itself, how could an entire road? He reached the temple gate just as the first bell of evening sounded. The deep tone rolled outward into the forest, vibrating gently through the air. He had heard that bell countless times. But tonight, the sound did not feel like a signal. It felt like an event. The vibration entered his chest before dissolving into silence. A monk sweeping near the entrance glanced up and bowed politely. Haru returned the bow and stepped inside. The courtyard was simple gravel raked in quiet patterns, a few lanterns beginning to glow as daylight faded. Cedar trees stood along the perimeter, tall and patient. He sat on the wooden steps outside the main hall. From this vantage point, the entire valley stretched below. In his youth, he had looked at this view with ambition. He had imagined the vast world beyond the mountains, calling him forward. Later, he had looked with regret, wishing he could rewrite parts of his life. Now he simply looked. Smoke rose gently from chimneys in the village below. Evening light touched the rooftops unevenly. A thin line of river reflected the last brightness of the sky. Nothing about the scene was extraordinary. Yet nothing about it was the same as any view he had seen before. The clouds were arranged differently. The color of the sky was shifting second by second. The air carried a different temperature, and he, the one observing, was not the same observer he had been on any previous climb. He realized something quietly profound. The road had never been stable. The temple had never been permanent. The view had never been identical. What had remained constant was the story in his mind that said, "This is the same." And that story had dulled his attention. He closed his eyes briefly. He remembered himself as a boy, leaping from the stone near the base of the mountain. He remembered himself as a young man, climbing with restless hunger. He remembered himself returning in disappointment. Each version of himself believed he understood the road. None of them had seen it as it truly was. Because to see clearly he now understood required something simple: to release the assumption that anything is ever the same. When he opened his eyes, the evening light had shifted again. The bell sounded once more in the distance. A monk approached quietly and sat beside him without speaking. They watched the valley together. After some time, the monk asked gently, "Have you walked this road before?" Haru smiled. "Yes," he said. Then he paused. "No," he added softly. The monk looked at him with curiosity. Haru's eyes remained on the horizon. "I have walked something like it," he said, "but never this one." The monk nodded slowly. The wind moved lightly through the cedars. Haru felt no desire to hold on to the moment. He did not try to preserve the view in memory. He did not try to turn it into a lesson. He simply sat. The road he would walk down in darkness later that evening would not be the same road he climbed. The descent would be new. The next morning would be new. Even if he remained in the village for the rest of his life, the path would continue to shift, and so would he. He understood now that beginner's mind is not only about curiosity, it is about humility. It is the quiet recognition that nothing can be fully grasped, because nothing stands still. Not the road, not the breath, not the self. The sky dimmed into deep blue. Haru rose slowly from the steps and bowed toward the silent hall. Then he turned and began walking back down the mountain. Each step met the earth as if for the first time, and in truth it was. To see that the road is never the same is to loosen our grip on permanence. To feel each step as new is to soften the illusion of repetition. But even when we understand change, even when we recognize impermanence, there is one more attachment that remains deeply hidden. The attachment to being right. We like to know, we like to understand, we like to feel certain. Certainty gives us stability. Certainty gives us identity. Certainty makes the world feel predictable, and so quietly we begin to cling to our conclusions. We say, "I know how this works, I understand people, I know myself, I know what this means." But the moment we say, "I know something," closes. Curiosity fades. Listening narrows. Possibility disappears. Beginner's mind does not only ask us to see freshly, it asks something far more vulnerable. It asks us to admit "I don't know," not as weakness, not as ignorance, but as openness. There was once a man who prided himself on understanding everything around him. He could analyze, explain, and categorize with ease. Others admired his intelligence. They sought his advice. And yet beneath his knowledge, something remained restless. Because knowing everything left no space for discovery. And one day, through a simple encounter, he was shown that the most powerful doorway to wisdom begins with 3 quiet words. I don't know. Let us continue. In a town not far from the mountains, there lived a man named Koji. Koji was known for his intelligence. He was not a monk. He was not a craftsman. He was not a scholar of sutras. He was something far more common. He was someone who always had an answer. If neighbors argued, Koji explained who was right. If someone felt confused, Koji clarified what they should think. If news arrived from distant cities, Koji interpreted it confidently. People admired his certainty. It is good to ask Koji, they would say. He understands things. And Koji believed this too. He believed he understood people. He believed he understood events. He believed he understood himself. When others hesitated, he spoke. When others questioned, he concluded. When others wondered, he decided. He rarely said, I don't know. Not because he was arrogant, but because uncertainty felt uncomfortable. Not knowing created space, and space felt unstable. One autumn afternoon, Koji visited a small tea house at the edge of town. He often went there to meet travelers. Travelers brought stories, stories brought topics, and topics allowed him to explain. That day, an elderly traveler sat alone near the window. His robes were simple, his movements were unhurried. He sipped tea without distraction, as if nothing else demanded his attention. Koji approached him politely. "May I sit?" he asked. The traveler nodded. They exchanged greetings. Koji asked where the man had come from. "From the northern hills," the traveler replied. "Ah," Koji said quickly. "The northern hills are known for harsh winters. The soil there is thin. Farming must be difficult." The traveler smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. Koji continued. "I have heard the villages there are smaller than here. People rely on one another closely. Life must be simple." The traveler took another sip of tea. "Yes," he said again. Koji felt encouraged. "And the monasteries in that region follow stricter forms of practice. Do they not? I have read about them. Their discipline is renowned." The traveler placed his cup down carefully. "Have you visited?" he asked gently. "No," Koji admitted. "But I have studied accounts." The traveler nodded. They sat quietly for a moment. Koji felt the silence pressing against him. He did not enjoy silence. Silence left nothing to explain. "So," Koji said, "what brings you here? I am passing through," the traveler replied. "Observing." "Observing what?" Koji asked. The traveler looked out the window. "The way people speak," he said. Koji laughed lightly. "Oh, and what have you observed?" The traveler turned back toward him. "I have observed that many people speak not to discover, but to confirm." Koji felt a faint tightening in his chest. "What do you mean?" The traveler's eyes were calm. "When I mention the northern hills, you tell me what they are like. When I sit quietly, you fill the space with explanation. When I pause, you assume you already understand." Koji felt heat rise slightly in his face. "I am only making conversation," he said. "Yes," the traveler replied. "But conversation can be inquiry, or it can be conclusion." The words landed softly. Koji opened his mouth to respond, but something stopped him. He realized that even now he was preparing to defend himself, to explain why he was right, to interpret the traveler's words. He had not once asked what the northern hills felt like. He had not asked what the traveler had experienced. He had spoken as if knowledge about a place was equal to living in it. The silence returned. This time, Koji did not immediately fill it. He noticed the sound of tea being poured at another table, the faint scrape of ceramic against wood, the low murmur of distant voices. He felt unfamiliar territory opening within him. Uncertainty. The traveler picked up his cup again. "Tell me," he said gently, "what do you not know?" The question startled Koji. He searched quickly for something clever to say, but every answer that came to mind felt like another display of knowing. He could say he did not know distant lands. He could say he did not know the future. But these were safe answers. The traveler waited patiently. Koji felt the discomfort grow. He realized something unsettling. He did not practice not knowing. He practiced explaining. He had built his identity on clarity, on interpretation, on being the one who understood. But sitting here now, he saw that his understanding often arrived too quickly. It closed doors before they opened. It replaced curiosity with conclusion. The traveler spoke softly. "Not knowing is not ignorance. It is space." Koji looked at him. Space for what he asked. For discovery, the traveler replied. For listening. For seeing what is actually here, instead of what you expect. Koji felt the words settle slowly. He thought of conversations he had rushed through. Arguments he had resolved without truly hearing both sides. Moments where someone's uncertainty had made him uncomfortable, so he had supplied an answer. He had believed he was helping. Perhaps sometimes he was, but perhaps sometimes he was also avoiding something. The vulnerability of not being sure. The humility of saying, "I don't know." The traveler finished his tea and stood. "I will leave tomorrow morning," he said. "If you wish to continue this conversation, come early." Koji nodded. As the traveler walked away, Koji remained seated. For the first time in a long while, he did not have a conclusion. He did not know what to think about the encounter. He did not know whether he agreed. He did not know whether he was offended. He simply sat with the unfamiliar sensation of not knowing. And though it felt unstable, it also felt strangely open. Koji did not sleep easily that night. He lay awake listening to the faint sounds of wind against the shutters of his home. Again and again, the traveler's question returned to him. "What do you not know?" At first, his mind attempted to answer defensively. "I do not know the details of distant kingdoms. I do not know the outcome of next year's harvest. I do not know the private thoughts of others." But each answer felt superficial. He sensed that the traveler had not been asking about information. He had been asking about posture. How do you stand before the unknown? Do you rush to fill it, or can you remain within it before dawn? Koji rose and dressed quietly. The sky was still dark when he stepped into the street. The air carried the cool stillness that comes before sunrise. No one else was awake. He walked to the tea house. The traveler was already seated near the window. Koji bowed. "You came," the traveler said. "Yes," Koji replied. Then after a pause he added, "I do not know why I came." The traveler smiled faintly. "That is a beginning." They sat together in silence for a few moments. Koji felt the urge to speak, to explain his thoughts from the night before, to summarize what he had realized. Instead, he waited. The traveler poured tea for both of them. "Yesterday," Koji said slowly. When you asked what I do not know, I could not answer honestly. Why not? The traveler asked. Because I am accustomed to knowing, Koji admitted, or at least to appearing as though I do. The traveler nodded. And what happens when you do not know? Koji hesitated. I feel exposed, he said, as though I have nothing to offer. The traveler lifted his cup. Perhaps you are confusing answers with presence. Koji looked up. Explain, he said automatically, then caught himself. The traveler noticed the shift and smiled. When someone comes to you with confusion, he said, what do they need first? Clarity, Koji replied. Or attention, the traveler asked. Koji paused. He remembered moments when people had spoken to him, not because they needed solutions, but because they needed to be heard. He remembered how quickly he had supplied interpretations. Perhaps sometimes they had needed space instead. If you rush to explain, the traveler continued, you may prevent something from unfolding. Not knowing creates room for others to discover their own understanding. Koji felt the words settle deeply. But is not knowledge valuable? He asked carefully. It is, the traveler replied. But knowledge should serve inquiry, not replace it. They sat quietly again. Morning light began to filter through the window. Koji watched dust particles drift through the air. He felt something unfamiliar, but gentle. He did not feel the need to impress the traveler. He did not feel the need to demonstrate intelligence. He felt available. Say it, the traveler said softly. Koji looked at him. Say what? The 3 words you avoid. Koji swallowed. He had said them before in trivial situations, but rarely in matters that touched his identity. Slowly, deliberately, he spoke. I don't know. The words felt simple, yet as they left his mouth, something loosened inside him. He did not collapse. He did not disappear. He did not lose worth. He remained. The traveler nodded. Good, he said. Now you can begin to learn. Koji felt a quiet humility arise. For years he had believed learning meant accumulating more explanations. Now he sensed that learning might also mean removing assumptions. That afternoon as he walked through town, neighbors greeted him as usual. One man complained about a dispute with his brother. Koji listened. The familiar impulse to resolve the issue quickly rose within him. But instead of offering an immediate conclusion, he asked a question. What do you feel? The man hesitated, surprised. He began speaking more slowly. Koji did not interrupt. For the first time, he was not preparing an answer while the other person spoke. He was listening. And within that listening, he discovered something unexpected. Not knowing did not diminish him. It made space for others. In the days that followed, Koji practiced quietly. When he did not understand, he admitted it. When he was uncertain, he allowed it. When silence appeared, he did not rush to fill it. He did not abandon knowledge. He simply stopped clinging to it. And slowly his conversations changed. They became less about proving clarity and more about discovering truth together. Koji came to understand that beginner's mind is not the absence of wisdom. It is the willingness to stand before the unknown without closing it too quickly. Sometimes the most honest answer is not an explanation. It is 3 simple words, I don't know. To say I don't know is a quiet revolution. It loosens the grip of certainty. It softens the need to be right. It opens a space where something new can appear. But there is a deeper layer still. It is one thing for an ordinary man to release his attachment to knowing. It is another for a scholar, for someone whose identity is built upon study, whose reputation rests on interpretation, whose confidence is supported by years of accumulated knowledge. Knowledge in such a life is not simply information. It is status, it is security, it is self. To say, "I don't know" in that position feels far more threatening, because it is not just an admission of uncertainty, it is a loosening of identity. There was once a respected scholar who had spent decades studying sacred texts. He could recite passages flawlessly. He could debate subtle philosophical distinctions with precision. Students gathered around him in admiration, and yet beneath his mastery there was a quiet restlessness. Because even the most refined understanding can become another form of attachment. And sometimes the most difficult cup to empty is the one filled with wisdom. Let us continue. Professor Natsuo had devoted his entire adult life to the study of sacred texts. From the age of 19, he had immersed himself in scripture. He memorized long passages before he understood them. He compared translations, studied commentaries, debated interpretations late into the night with other scholars. By the time he reached middle age, his name was known far beyond his university. Students filled his lecture hall. He spoke with clarity. He quoted precisely. He could trace the evolution of a single doctrinal phrase across centuries of teaching. When asked difficult questions, he rarely paused. His answers came quickly, organized and confident. People respected him. Some even admired him. And quietly, without intending to, Professor Natsuo began to admire himself. Not in an obvious way. He did not boast. He did not mock those who knew less. But he took comfort in the certainty of his understanding. When students asked, "What does this passage mean?" he explained. When colleagues disagreed, he defended his interpretation with careful logic. When uncertainty appeared, he resolved it. He had built a life around clarity. One spring semester, a young exchange student named Yuki joined his class. Yuki was quiet. She took notes diligently. She did not interrupt lectures or challenge arguments, but occasionally she would ask a question. Not a technical question, not a request for clarification, a different kind of question. One afternoon, Professor Natsuo had just completed a detailed explanation of a complex philosophical concept, the relationship between emptiness and form. He concluded his lecture with a polished summary. "As you can see," he said, "emptiness does not negate form. It allows form to arise without fixed identity." Several students nodded. Yuki raised her hand. "Yes," he said. She hesitated slightly. "Professor," she asked, "when you say emptiness allows form to arise, what does that feel like?" The room grew still. Professor Natsuo blinked. "Feel like," he repeated. "Yes," she said gently. "In your own experience." He cleared his throat. "The question concerns philosophical structure," he replied. "It is not primarily about feeling." Yuki lowered her hand politely. The lecture continued, but something in him felt unsettled. He dismissed it as distraction. In the weeks that followed, Yuki asked similar questions. "When you speak about non-attachment," she said one morning, "what do you let go of? When you describe awareness," she asked another day, "where is it located for you?" Each time Professor Natsuo responded with analysis. He referenced texts, he clarified definitions, he explained historical context, and each time Yuki nodded. But her questions lingered. One evening, long after students had left, Professor Natsuo remained alone in his office. Stacks of books surrounded him. He looked at the shelves lined with decades of study. He realized that he could explain almost every concept within them. But could he answer Yuki's questions? What does emptiness feel like? Where is awareness located? What do you let go of? He felt a flicker of discomfort. He had always assumed that understanding meant explanation, that clarity meant precision. But these questions were not about structure, they were about experience. He closed one of the books, slowly. In all his years of study, he had rarely allowed himself to sit without analysis. He had moved from text to text, from theory to theory. But when had he last sat quietly and examined his own direct experience without interpreting it through doctrine? The following week, Yuki approached him after class. "Professor," she said respectfully, "may I ask one more question?" He nodded. "When you teach about awakening," she said, "do you speak from knowing or from understanding?" The distinction was subtle, but it struck him deeply. He felt the familiar impulse to clarify the terms. Instead, something unusual happened. He paused. The classroom was empty, except for the two of them. For perhaps the first time in years, Professor Natsuo did not reach immediately for explanation. He searched inwardly. Did he know, or did he understand, and was there a difference? He realized that much of what he possessed was refined understanding, carefully constructed, well-supported, logically sound. But knowing in the way Yuki seemed to be asking felt different. It felt less secure, less structured. He felt exposed. His reputation rested on answers. If he said, "I don't know," what would remain? He looked at Yuki. Her expression was not challenging. It was open, waiting. The silence lengthened, and within that silence, something fragile and honest began to form. He realized he had spent decades interpreting the map, but he had rarely admitted that he was still walking the territory. Slowly, carefully, he spoke. "I understand the teachings," he said. He swallowed. "But I am still learning what they mean." It was not a full surrender, but it was not complete certainty either. Yuki bowed slightly. "Thank you," she said. As she left the room, Professor Natsuo remained standing. He felt both diminished and expanded at the same time. For years he had protected his image as someone who knew. Now a small crack had appeared in that image, and through that crack, something new was beginning to enter. In the days after his conversation with Yuki, Professor Natsuo found himself unsettled in a way he could not easily explain. Nothing in his outer life had changed. His lectures continued. His colleagues still consulted him. His students still took careful notes. But internally something had shifted. He became aware of how quickly answers formed in his mind. When a student raised a question, he could feel the mechanism activating the rapid search through memory, the assembling of references, the selection of the most elegant phrasing. He had once taken pride in this speed. Now he began to notice what it prevented. There was no pause, no space, no room for uncertainty. One afternoon during a seminar discussion, a student asked Professor, "Is enlightenment a state that can be described at all?" The old reflex stirred immediately. He could cite multiple sources. He could compare positions from different schools. He could construct a precise, layered answer. But before speaking, he felt Yuki's earlier question echo inside him. "What does it feel like?" he inhaled. For the first time in his academic career, he allowed himself to delay. The students waited. He sensed their expectation, and beneath that expectation, he felt his own fear. If he did not answer smoothly, What would they think? Would they doubt his authority? Would they question his competence? The room felt very quiet. Finally, he spoke. Many descriptions have been offered. He began. The familiar structure of explanation started to unfold. Then he stopped. The interruption startled even him. He closed the book that lay open before him. "I can explain how various traditions describe enlightenment," he said slowly. "But if you are asking whether I can describe it from direct realization, I cannot claim that honestly." A few students shifted in their seats. The air felt different. He continued, "I understand the language, I understand the philosophy, but understanding language is not the same as embodying what it points to." Silence followed, not awkward, but attentive. He felt his heart beating more quickly than usual. There it was, the place he had avoided for decades. The simple admission that knowledge has limits. After class, several students approached him. He expected disappointment. Instead, he saw something else. Respect. "Thank you for saying that," one student said quietly. "It makes the teaching feel more real." He was surprised. He had imagined that certainty created trust. Now he began to see that honesty created something deeper. That evening, he returned to his office and sat without opening a book. The shelves around him no longer felt like proof of mastery. They felt like companions, texts pointing, not trophies proving arrival. He closed his eyes. Instead of analyzing a concept, he observed his breath. Inhale, exhale. Thoughts arose, definitions, arguments, interpretations. He did not follow them. For a few moments, he simply remained with sensation. It felt unfamiliar, unstructured, but not empty. He understood something quietly important. For years, he had used knowledge as protection. Protection from vulnerability. Protection from uncertainty. Protection from the humility of being a student again. But beginner's mind does not disappear with age. It waits beneath the layers of accumulated certainty. The next week, Yuki once again raised her hand. "Professor," she asked, "what is the most important thing you have learned?" He smiled gently. This time there was no tension in the pause. "The most important thing," he said, "is that I am still learning." The class laughed softly, but he continued, "And that is not a weakness. It is the path." He no longer felt the need to defend his authority. He no longer felt threatened by questions that reached beyond theory. He had not lost knowledge. He had lost the need to cling to it. And in that loosening, his teaching changed. His lectures became less about delivering conclusions and more about inviting inquiry. He asked students what they noticed in their own experience. He left certain questions open. He allowed silence to remain longer than before. Some colleagues found this shift unusual, but his students felt something new. The classroom was no longer a place where answers were displayed. It had become a place where exploration was possible. One evening as the semester ended, Professor Natsuo stood alone at the window of his office. The campus courtyard lay quiet below. He thought of the young man he had once been, eager, disciplined, determined to master doctrine. He did not regret those years. They had shaped him. But he saw now that mastery without humility becomes rigid, and rigidity closes the door that wisdom tries to open. He whispered the words again, not as defeat, but as freedom. "I don't know." And for the first time in many years, those words did not diminish him. They made him vast. To admit I don't know within a classroom is an act of humility. To loosen the grip of intellectual certainty is a deep transformation. But there are moments in life where uncertainty does not feel philosophical. It feels urgent. In those moments, the pressure to know becomes intense. When someone is suffering, when time is short, when a decision must be made quickly. In such situations, not knowing can feel dangerous. We imagine that confidence alone can save, that speed alone can solve, that certainty alone can protect. And yet sometimes the most harmful mistake arises from assuming we already understand. There was once a doctor known for his decisive skill. He rarely hesitated. He trusted his experience. Patients admired his assurance. But one day, faced with a case that seemed familiar, he almost made a fatal error. Because what looked like something he had seen before was not the same at all. And it was only when he stopped assuming he knew that he truly began to see. Let us continue. Dr. Sato had built his reputation on decisiveness. For more than 25 years, he had worked in a busy city hospital. He had treated broken bones, severe infections, internal bleeding, and countless illnesses that blurred into one another over time. He was known for two qualities: speed and confidence. When younger doctors hesitated, Dr. Sato moved forward. When others consulted textbooks, he relied on memory. When families looked frightened, his calm tone reassured them. Trust experience. He often told his residents, patterns repeat themselves. If you pay attention long enough, you begin to recognize them instantly. And in many cases, he was right. Medicine, like many disciplines, depends upon pattern recognition. Symptoms cluster, causes produce effects. A trained eye sees what others miss. Over the years, Dr. Sato had learned to diagnose within minutes what once took him hours, and that efficiency saved lives. One winter evening near the end of a long shift, a young woman was rushed into the emergency ward. She was pale and sweating. Her breathing was shallow. Her pulse was elevated. The nurse handed Dr. Sato the initial report. Abdominal pain, nausea, dizziness. Dr. Sato scanned the details quickly. He had seen this before. Dehydration, possibly a stomach infection. He approached the patient. "How long have you felt this way?" he asked. "Since this afternoon," she whispered. "Have you eaten anything unusual?" She shook her head weakly. Her answers were brief. Her discomfort was clear. Dr. Sato pressed lightly on her abdomen. She winced. Yes, he thought. Gastrointestinal distress. He turned to the nurse. "Start fluids. Prepare anti-nausea medication." The team moved efficiently, but as they worked, something small and subtle interrupted his certainty. The pattern did not fit perfectly. Her skin was colder than expected. Her pulse slightly irregular. He paused. In the past, he might have dismissed these inconsistencies as minor variations. After all, no case mirrors another exactly. But the memory of his own teaching returned to him. Patterns repeat. He looked at the young woman again. Her eyes were unfocused. He felt a flicker of doubt. What if this is not what it appears to be? The doubt was uncomfortable. He had already given instructions. To reverse course now would mean admitting uncertainty in front of his team. Time mattered, confidence mattered, and yet something inside him resisted moving forward automatically. He stepped back from the bed. "Wait," he said. The nurse looked up. "Doctor." Dr. Sato inhaled slowly. "Run additional tests," he said. "Check cardiac markers. Monitor her blood pressure closely. One of the younger residents hesitated, but her symptoms suggest. I know, Dr. Sato interrupted gently. They suggest something common, but I am not certain. The words surprised even him. He had rarely spoken them in an emergency room. I am not certain. The additional tests were conducted quickly. Minutes passed. The results returned. Not dehydration, not infection. A rare cardiac complication. Had he proceeded with his initial assumption alone, the delay in proper treatment could have been fatal. Dr. Sato felt a quiet chill. He looked at the young woman again. Her condition required immediate intervention. A different course entirely from what he had first ordered. He gave new instructions, precise and urgent. This time his decisiveness was guided not by assumption, but by verification. Hours later, after the crisis had passed and the patient stabilized, Dr. Sato remained seated alone in his office. The hospital corridors were quieter now. He replayed the moment in his mind, the familiar symptoms, the rapid conclusion, the subtle inconsistencies. He realized how easily experience can become expectation, how quickly the mind says, I know this. In many cases, such recognition is invaluable. But when recognition becomes assumption, it blinds. He thought of the young doctors he had trained. How often had he emphasized speed? How often had he praised immediate diagnosis? There is value in skill, but there is danger in certainty. That night, Dr. Sato wrote a note to himself. Experience is not the enemy, but experience must remain open. The next morning during rounds he addressed his team. Yesterday, he said calmly, I almost made a mistake. The room grew still. The symptoms looked familiar. I believed I recognized the pattern, but I was wrong. He paused. What saved the patient was not my knowledge, it was my doubt. The younger doctors listened closely. Never let confidence silence curiosity, he continued. Even when something appears obvious, ask again, look again. He did not diminish experience, he reframed it. Experience should guide attention, not replace it. As the team dispersed, Dr. Sato felt something steady within him. He had not become less skilled. He had become more careful, more open, more willing to say, even in urgency, I am not certain. And in that willingness, he had truly begun to see. In the weeks following the incident, Dr. Sato noticed a subtle but lasting change in himself. He still moved efficiently through hospital corridors. He still made decisions quickly when time required it. But something within his pace had softened. He no longer trusted the first conclusion as completely as before. Instead of asking only, what is this, he began asking, what else could this be? The difference was small, but it created space. One afternoon, a middle-aged man arrived with chest discomfort and shortness of breath. The symptoms suggested a common diagnosis. Dr. Sato recognized the pattern almost instantly. Yet this time, instead of announcing his conclusion immediately, he asked a few additional questions. When did it begin? What were you doing just before it started? Has anything like this happened before? The man hesitated. Yes, he said slowly, but it felt different. Different. In the past, Dr. Sato might have interpreted different through his own understanding. Now he leaned closer. How so, he asked. The patient described a subtle pressure that did not match the usual profile. It turned out to be a less common complication, one that required a modified approach. Again, attention made the difference. Dr. Sato began sharing this shift openly with his residents. During teaching rounds, he would say, "Tell me not only what you think it is, tell me what does not fit." At first, the younger doctors were confused. They had been trained as he had to arrive at answers efficiently. But gradually they learned to look for irregularities, to notice small details, to respect doubt. One evening, a resident asked him privately, "Doctor, doesn't hesitation slow you down?" Dr. Sato considered the question carefully. "Hesitation can," he said. "But curiosity does not." He paused. "There is a difference between fear and openness. Fear freezes, openness observes." The resident nodded. Dr. Sato understood something clearly now. His earlier confidence had not been entirely wrong. Experience is earned, skill matters, but skill becomes dangerous when it hardens into assumption. He remembered the young woman from that winter night, how easily her symptoms had matched a familiar pattern, how easily he had almost closed the case in his mind. The memory no longer frightened him. It instructed him. Months later, he was invited to give a lecture to a group of medical students. They expected him to speak about advanced diagnostics. Instead, he began with a story. "There was a case," he said, "where I nearly trusted my experience more than the patient." The students leaned forward. "I recognized the pattern too quickly," he continued. "And because I recognized it, I stopped looking." He let the sentence rest in the air. In medicine, as in life, the danger is not ignorance, it is premature certainty. He walked slowly across the room. Experience should sharpen your perception, not narrow it. He wrote 3 words on the board. "Look again." That, he said, is often the difference between harm and healing. After the lecture, one student approached him. "Doctor," she said, "isn't it exhausting to question yourself constantly?" He smiled. "It is exhausting to defend certainty," he replied. "It is not exhausting to stay awake." That evening, as he left the hospital, he paused near the entrance and watched patients and families move through the doors. He felt no loss of authority. He felt no insecurity. Instead, he felt lighter. He no longer needed to appear infallible. He needed only to remain attentive. Beginner's mind, he realized, does not require the abandonment of expertise. It requires the softening of ego within expertise. It is the quiet willingness to admit that each patient, each symptom, each moment is slightly different from the last, and that difference matters. He looked up at the darkening sky above the hospital building. For years he had relied on recognition. Now he relied on presence, and in that presence his skill did not diminish. It deepened, because he was no longer treating patterns, he was meeting people, and that made all the difference. To remain open in moments of pressure is rare. To admit uncertainty when lives depend on clarity is even rarer. But beneath certainty, beneath expertise, beneath identity itself, there is something even more fundamental. We assume that things are solid. We assume that people are fixed. We assume that roles are permanent. We assume that the world holds still long enough for us to understand it. Yet everything we have seen so far suggests otherwise. The cup was never truly full. The wood was never merely wood. The garden was never the same. The rice was never ordinary. The road was never repeated. Knowledge was never complete. Diagnosis was never final. Again and again the surface appeared stable, and again deeper attention revealed movement. Beginner's mind does not only soften certainty, it begins to reveal something more unsettling. Nothing is fixed, not our thoughts, not our identities, not even the stories we tell about ourselves. There was once a man who believed he knew exactly who he was. He had defined himself clearly by profession, by reputation, by history. But when circumstances shifted, that solid identity began to dissolve. And in that dissolving, he discovered that what he had called self was far less permanent than he imagined. Let us continue. Kenji had always known exactly who he was. If someone asked, he answered without hesitation. I am the director of the company. I am the eldest son. I am the one people rely on. His identity was clear. It was built from achievement, from responsibility, from recognition. For more than 20 years, Kenji had worked at the same firm. He began as a junior assistant and rose steadily through discipline and long hours. Eventually, he became director. His title carried weight. When he entered a room, conversation shifted. When he spoke, decisions followed. His signature finalized contracts. His opinion shaped strategy. He did not think of this as ego. He thought of it as fact. This is who I am. Outside of work, he was equally defined. As the eldest son, he managed family matters. He handled finances. He mediated disputes between relatives. At gatherings, others deferred to him. He carried responsibility carefully, and over time, responsibility hardened into identity. Then, without warning, circumstances changed. The company merged with a larger corporation. Leadership was restructured. Positions were consolidated. One afternoon, Kenji was called into a meeting. The conversation was polite, professional, final. His role was no longer necessary. He would receive compensation. His contributions were appreciated. But his title would end. He nodded calmly. He had always been composed. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat down. The room looked the same. The desk, the framed certificates, the shelves lined with reports bearing his name. But something invisible had shifted. Director. The word no longer applied. He packed his belongings slowly. Colleagues expressed sympathy. Some offered assurances that he would find something else quickly. He thanked them, but as he walked out of the building for the last time, he felt a strange emptiness. Not grief, not anger, something quieter. If I am not director, who am I? At home, the change seemed less dramatic. He was still eldest son, still responsible, but without the structure of his professional identity, something felt unstable. Days passed. He woke in the morning without an office to go to. He poured tea and sat at the table longer than usual. Silence filled the house. He noticed how often his thoughts returned to the same sentence. I used to be someone. The phrase startled him. Used to be. Was his existence truly anchored in a title? He began introducing himself differently. When acquaintances asked what he did, he hesitated. I worked in corporate management, he said. The past tense felt heavy. Without the role, conversation shifted subtly. Some people seemed less attentive. Some moved on quickly. He realized how much of his social identity had depended upon position. One afternoon, while walking through a park near his home, he passed a group of children playing. They were building something from fallen branches. None of them asked who the others were. None of them needed titles. They simply acted. He sat on a nearby bench and watched. For years, his sense of self had been reinforced daily by business cards, meetings, responsibilities. Now, without those markers, he felt undefined. And that undefinition frightened him. He closed his eyes briefly. Who am I without the role? The question had no immediate answer. His mind reached for substitutes. I am experienced, I am respected, I am capable. But each description felt like another attempt to solidify something shifting. He thought of the many labels he had carried across his life: student, employee, manager, director, son, provider. Each one had felt stable while it lasted. Each one had eventually changed, yet something remained continuous through all of them. What was that? He opened his eyes. The children were laughing. A small structure they had built collapsed suddenly. They paused, then began rebuilding without complaint. No one declared the structure a failure. No one mourned its loss. They simply adjusted. Kenji felt a quiet recognition. He had mistaken role for self. He had assumed that the name others used for him defined his existence. But titles arise and titles fall away. If identity depends entirely upon them, then identity is fragile. The sun shifted lower in the sky. He remained seated longer than intended. For the first time since leaving his office, he did not try to reconstruct who he was. He allowed the question to remain open. Who am I? Without the name, the uncertainty did not resolve, but it did not crush him either. It created space, and in that space, something quieter, less defined, but more stable began to reveal itself. Not a title, not a position, simply awareness of being. He stood slowly and began walking home. He did not yet have an answer, but for the first time he sensed that losing his name might not mean losing himself. It might mean discovering what had never depended on a name at all. In the days that followed, Kenji resisted the urge to immediately replace what he had lost. Several former colleagues reached out with suggestions. You should apply for another directorship. With your experience, you won't stay unemployed long. He thanked them politely. He updated his resume. But he did not rush. For the first time in decades, there was no schedule waiting for him in the morning. No meetings, no titles attached to his name. The quiet unsettled him at first. He noticed how often he instinctively reached for his phone as though expecting someone to need him. When no message appeared, a subtle discomfort surfaced. Who am I if no one is calling? One afternoon, he visited his elderly mother. She poured tea as she always had, her movements slow but steady. You seem thinner, she observed gently. I am adjusting, he replied. She nodded. When your father retired, she said he walked through the house for weeks as if he had misplaced something. Kenji smiled faintly. What did he lose? He asked. Nothing, she said. Only the idea of who he thought he was. The words lingered. On his walk home, Kenji reflected on how firmly he had held to that idea. Director, leader, provider. These words had structured his days. They had given him direction, but they had also confined him. He realized that he had rarely acted outside those definitions. Even his tone of voice at home sometimes carried the authority of his office. Even his posture reflected his position. Now stripped of title, something unfamiliar began to appear. Simplicity. He began rising early, not out of obligation but out of habit. He walked to the same park where he had watched the children build and rebuild their structure. This time he sat longer. He noticed the rhythm of his breathing, the sound of distant traffic, the shifting light through branches overhead. No one in the park knew who he had been. No one addressed him as director. He was simply another man sitting on a bench. At first, that anonymity felt like diminishment. Gradually, it began to feel like relief. Without the need to uphold an image, he felt lighter. He did not have to appear decisive. He did not have to demonstrate competence. He did not have to solve anything. He could simply observe. One morning, a child approached him. "Can you help us?" the boy asked, pointing toward the group building again from fallen branches. Kenji stood and followed. The structure they were attempting kept collapsing. In the past, he would have instinctively taken charge. He would have analyzed the weakness, reorganized the effort, assigned roles. Instead, he crouched beside them. "What do you think would make it stronger?" he asked. The children experimented. They adjusted angles. They tried again. When the structure finally held, they cheered. No one asked his name. No one needed his history. He had contributed without identity, and it was enough. As weeks passed, Kenji noticed that the question, "Who am I?" no longer demanded an immediate answer. Instead, it softened. He began to sense that what he truly was had never depended upon the roles he played. The roles had shaped expression, but they had not created existence. Student, employee, director. These were garments worn for a time, necessary, functional, but removable. What remained beneath them did not vanish when the garments were removed. It was quieter, less divined, but steady. He began volunteering at a community center, helping with administrative tasks. There was no prestige attached, no public recognition. Yet he worked with the same care he had once given to corporate strategy. Not because it defined him, but because it was what was needed in that moment. One evening, while organizing donated supplies, he caught his reflection in a window. For a brief instant, he expected to see the confident director staring back. Instead, he saw an older man with softer features, not diminished, not grand, simply present. He realized something subtle and freeing. Identity is useful, but it is not solid. It shifts with circumstance. It rises and falls like titles, like positions, like names written on doors and later removed. To cling to identity as permanent is to suffer each time it changes. To see identity as fluid is to move with life more gently. He thought again of the children rebuilding their structure without mourning its collapse. Perhaps the self too could be rebuilt, not as fixed architecture, but as responsive design. The next time someone asked what he did, he answered differently. "I'm exploring what comes next," he said. It was not a position. It was not a title. It was honest. That night, as he prepared for sleep, he no longer felt the heaviness of having used to be someone. He understood now that he had never stopped being someone. He had simply stopped being that someone, and beneath every version of himself, director, son, volunteer man on a bench, there was a quieter truth, awareness, presence, being that did not require a name, that did not depend on recognition, that did not disappear when titles dissolved. Kenji lay down and closed his eyes. He did not yet know what role he would play next, but for the first time he sensed that whatever name came, or did not come, he would remain. Not fixed, not defined, but whole. And that was enough. To loosen identity is to step into unfamiliar ground. When titles fall away, when roles dissolve, when the name we once carried no longer defines us, something quiet remains. Not fixed, not solid, not easily described. We begin to see that what we call self is more fluid than we imagined. But even here, a subtle attachment can linger. We may let go of position. We may soften certainty. We may release rigid identity. And still, we quietly search for something to hold. A new role, a new understanding, a new version of ourselves to become. The mind is subtle in its desire for stability. It asks, if I am not that, then what am I now? Yet beginner's mind does not rush to rebuild. It does not hurry to redefine. It allows space to remain open. There was once a woman who spent her entire life seeking clarity about purpose, about meaning, about who she was meant to be. She moved from teacher to teacher, from philosophy to philosophy, from one answer to another. But the more she searched, the more restless she became, until one day she stopped searching, and in stopping, she discovered something she had overlooked all along. Let us continue. For as long as she could remember, Aiko had been searching. As a child, she searched for approval. She studied hard, listened carefully, and tried to anticipate what others expected of her. If she could understand what was required, she believed she could become it. As a young woman, she searched for purpose. She read philosophy late into the night. She attended lectures, copied quotations into notebooks, and underlined sentences that promised clarity. Each new idea felt like a doorway. Each doorway led to another corridor. After university, she searched for fulfillment in work. She changed careers twice, convinced each time that the next path would feel more aligned, more meaningful, more complete. When satisfaction faded, she assumed she had chosen incorrectly. There must be something I am missing, she often thought. Her search was not frantic. It was disciplined. She approached life like a careful investigator, collecting insights, comparing teachings, refining her understanding. Friends admired her thoughtfulness. "You are always growing," they would say. She took that as encouragement. Yet beneath the steady movement forward, there was a quiet restlessness she could not name. Even during moments of achievement, a subtle question remained. Is this it? She traveled to monasteries in distant towns. She listened to teachers speak about awakening, simplicity, surrender. She practiced meditation with dedication. For a time, each practice brought calm. Then the calm would thin, and she would begin again. One autumn, after returning from a retreat, Aiko felt more tired than inspired. The teachings had been clear, the guidance sincere. Yet as she unpacked her bag at home, she noticed a familiar sensation rising. What next? The question came automatically. What should I study now? What should I refine? What part of myself still needs correction? She sat on the floor, surrounded by books and folded clothes, and suddenly felt the weight of years spent reaching for something just beyond her grasp. What if nothing is missing? The thought startled her. It did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like a pause. In the days that followed, she decided, not dramatically, not as a declaration, but quietly, to stop searching. She did not stop reading entirely. She did not abandon meditation. She simply stopped using them as tools to arrive somewhere else. When she sat in the morning, she no longer tried to deepen her concentration. She no longer evaluated whether the session had been good or productive. She sat. When thoughts appeared, she did not analyze their meaning. When restlessness surfaced, she did not treat it as a flaw to correct. She allowed the experience to be exactly what it was. At first, the habit of searching returned quickly. During quiet moments, her mind would whisper, Perhaps there is a better method. Perhaps you should revisit that teacher. Perhaps you have not yet found the right insight. Each time she noticed the movement, and gently she did nothing. One afternoon, she walked through her neighborhood without listening to a lecture through headphones as she usually did. The air was cool. Leaves gathered along the sidewalk. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary sounds, ordinary light. She realized how often she had walked while trying to improve herself. Now she walked without agenda. There was no lesson to extract, no state to achieve, just footsteps. In the absence of searching, something subtle began to shift. The constant tension of becoming softened. She noticed small details she had previously overlooked: the texture of tree bark, the warmth of tea in her hands, the way her breath moved without instruction. Nothing extraordinary occurred. No revelation descended. Yet the restlessness that had accompanied her for years began to loosen. She understood something simple and disarming. Her search had been built upon the assumption that she was incomplete, that somewhere just ahead, there existed a version of herself, more settled, more enlightened, more whole. But in the quiet moments when she stopped reaching, she could not find evidence of lack. There was thought, there was sensation, there was awareness, and that was enough. Weeks passed. Friends asked what she was studying lately. She smiled. Nothing new, she said. They assumed she was being modest, but she meant it. She was not gathering new philosophies. She was not refining a path. She was living. For the first time in years, she did not feel behind. She did not feel ahead. She simply felt present. And in that presence, the question that had once driven her, "What am I missing?" no longer demanded an answer, because she was no longer searching for completion. She was already here. As the weeks unfolded, Aiko began to notice how deeply the habit of searching had shaped her perception of life. It was not only in books or retreats that she had been looking for something more. It had been present in small, almost invisible ways, in the way she compared conversations afterward, in the way she evaluated her reactions, in the way she quietly measured whether a day had been meaningful enough. Now, without the constant project of self-improvement guiding her attention, she felt exposed at first. There was no ladder to climb, no milestone to reach, no internal checklist to complete before she could rest. On one particular morning, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching light spread slowly across the opposite building. In the past, she might have used such a moment to reflect intentionally, to extract insight from the stillness. She might have asked herself what the light symbolized, what lesson the quiet carried. Instead, she simply watched. The sunlight moved without effort. It did not attempt to improve the wall it touched. It did not search for a better surface. It appeared illuminated and continued on. Aiko felt a small, unexpected ease in that observation. For years, she had approached life as though it were incomplete without her intervention, as though every moment required refinement, interpretation, or direction. But the light on the wall required none of that. It was complete in its appearing. She began to see that her search had been fueled not only by curiosity, but by a subtle distrust of the present. Somewhere within her had lived the belief that this moment as it was could not possibly be enough. That belief had kept her moving toward insight, moving toward improvement, moving toward a future version of herself who would finally feel settled. But the more she searched for that future self, the more distant it seemed. Now, in the absence of striving, she noticed something almost startling in its simplicity. The sense of lack had been sustained by the act of searching itself. The mind would ask, "What is missing?" and then it would scan for an answer. In scanning, it reinforced the assumption that something must be absent. When she stopped scanning, the assumption weakened. One afternoon, while washing dishes, she found herself fully absorbed in the sensation of warm water against her hands, the clink of ceramic, the faint scent of soap. There was no revelation in it, no mystical depth, just the ordinary rhythm of cleaning a plate. Yet she felt unexpectedly content. She realized that contentment had never been as dramatic as she imagined. It did not arrive with fireworks or declarations. It was quiet, unannounced, easily overlooked when attention was fixed on somewhere else. Her friends began to notice a change. "You seem calmer," one said during lunch. Aiko considered the comment. "I think I am less busy," she replied. "But you're still working the same job," her friend said. "Yes," Aiko smiled, "but I am no longer working on myself all the time." The words surprised her as she said them. For years, she had treated herself as a project, something to refine, upgrade, and optimize. She had believed that growth required constant adjustment. Now she saw that growth can also unfold through acceptance. Without the pressure to become someone else, she began to act more naturally. She spoke when she had something to say. She remained silent when she did not. She chose activities because they felt appropriate, not because they promised advancement. The search had narrowed her vision to a single question: how can I improve? The absence of search widened it to something gentler. What is here, in that widening ordinary life, revealed unexpected depth. The sound of rain against the roof felt sufficient. The taste of rice at dinner felt complete. The fatigue at the end of a long day felt honest rather than inadequate. Nothing had been added to her life. Nothing dramatic had changed. Yet the quiet tension that had once accompanied her, the sense of chasing a horizon, had eased. One evening, as she prepared for sleep, she reflected on the years she had spent seeking answers. She did not regret them. The books, the teachers, the questions all had shaped her understanding. But she now recognized that no external teaching could have delivered what she had been searching for, because what she sought was not hidden. It had been obscured only by the belief that it was elsewhere. As she lay in the dark, she noticed her breath rising and falling without instruction. She did not try to deepen it. She did not attempt to turn it into meditation. She simply felt it. The search had ended not with a discovery, but with a release. Nothing was missing. Nothing had ever been missing. There had only been the habit of looking away. And now, with nowhere left to arrive, she rested not as someone who had achieved completion, but as someone who had stopped demanding it. In that stillness, life continued, unimproved, unfinished, enough. When the search falls away, life does not become extraordinary. It becomes simple. The sky remains the sky. Work remains work. Conversations remain imperfect and unfinished. The world does not rearrange itself to celebrate our realization. What changes is quieter. We stop leaning forward into the future. We stop measuring the present against an imagined completion. We stop treating ourselves as unfinished projects. And yet another subtle misunderstanding can appear here. When we hear that nothing is missing, we may assume that nothing matters. When we release striving, we may confuse it with indifference. When we stop searching, we may wonder whether purpose dissolves. But beginner's mind is not passivity. It is aliveness without tension. It is participation without clinging. There was once a man who believed that if nothing was lacking, then nothing needed to be done. He withdrew from effort, mistaking stillness for disengagement. Over time, his world grew smaller, until one day, through a simple encounter, he discovered that presence does not remove responsibility. It transforms it. Let us continue. After years of striving, Ren believed he had finally understood something important about life. He had spent most of his youth chasing achievement. He worked long hours, competed fiercely, and measured his worth by visible progress. When he encountered teachings about letting go, about releasing attachment and abandoning the endless hunger for more, he felt immediate relief. So he let go. At least he believed he did. He left his demanding job. He reduced his commitments. He stopped setting goals. When friends spoke about ambition, he smiled gently and said, "There is nowhere to arrive." At first, the shift felt liberating. Without pressure, his days seemed lighter. He slept longer. He spent afternoons sitting in cafes or wandering through the city without a schedule. If nothing is missing, he told himself there is nothing to pursue. But gradually, something subtle began to change. The lightness he had felt slowly thinned into dullness. Without intention, his days blurred together. He postponed small responsibilities. He delayed returning calls. He ignored bills until they demanded urgent attention. When discomfort arose, he reassured himself that striving was unnecessary. When effort felt inconvenient, he called it detachment. He mistook absence of ambition for wisdom. One evening, an old friend named Haruto visited him. They had once worked side by side in the same firm. Haruto had remained in his position and advanced steadily. "You seem calm," Haruto observed as they sat together. "I've stopped chasing," Ren replied. "There's freedom in that." Haruto nodded thoughtfully. "And what fills your days now?" Ren shrugged. "Whatever arises." The answer sounded serene, but as the words settled, Ren noticed a faint hollowness beneath them. Later that week, his landlord reminded him about late payments. A small leak in his kitchen went unfixed because he kept postponing the repair. His health appointments were rescheduled repeatedly. He told himself that none of it truly mattered, but unease gathered quietly. One afternoon, while walking through a nearby park, Ren noticed an elderly groundskeeper trimming shrubs along the path. The man worked steadily, carefully shaping each plant without haste. Ren paused to watch. The groundskeeper did not appear rushed, nor did he seem detached. His movements were deliberate, engaged. After a few minutes, Ren approached him. "Why do you work so carefully?" he asked. "In the end, the plants will grow wild again." The old man smiled. "Yes," he said, "they will." "Then why bother?" Ren pressed. The groundskeeper rested his shears against his shoulder. "Because this is what is here now," he replied. Ren frowned slightly. "I thought letting go meant not interfering," he said. The old man studied him with patient eyes. Letting go of what he asked, of striving, of control, of the need to shape everything. The groundskeeper nodded slowly. "Letting go of attachment is not the same as abandoning care," he said. "I do not trim these shrubs because I believe they must remain perfect. I trim them because this is the task in front of me." He bent and cut another branch with gentle precision. If I refused to act because nothing lasts, he continued, the garden would decay. If I clung to perfection, I would suffer each time it changed. So I work and I release. Ren felt something shift inside him. He had abandoned effort to avoid striving, but perhaps he had also abandoned responsibility. That evening, as he returned home, he noticed the small leak in his kitchen sink once more. For weeks he had ignored it, telling himself that urgency was illusion. Now he knelt beside it. He did not fix it to prove worth. He did not fix it to secure identity. He fixed it because it was there. The action felt simple, unburdened. In the following days, he began addressing neglected tasks, not with the frantic energy of his former ambition, but with steady attention. He returned messages. He scheduled appointments. He cleaned his apartment. He did not attach grand meaning to any of it. Yet something inside him felt clearer. He began to see that he had confused stillness with withdrawal. True letting go was not the absence of movement. It was movement without clinging, without the story that success would complete him, without the fear that failure would diminish him. As he walked again through the park a week later, he saw the groundskeeper tending a different section of shrubs. The man nodded in recognition. Ren nodded back. This time he did not ask why the work mattered. He understood. Nothing needed to be chased, but what was present still deserved care. And in that quiet distinction, he began to discover a deeper balance between letting go and showing up. In the weeks after his conversation with the groundskeeper, Ren began to test a different way of living. He did not return to his old habits of relentless ambition. He did not rebuild the identity he had once wrapped around productivity. Instead, he experimented quietly with presence in action. When he woke in the morning, he made his bed carefully. Not because order would improve his worth, and not because discipline guaranteed success, but because the bed was there, unmade, waiting. When dishes accumulated in the sink, he washed them without complaint and without drama. He did not narrate the act as spiritual practice. He did not frame it as self-improvement. He simply washed the dishes. At first, the simplicity felt almost too small. A voice in his mind occasionally whispered that none of this mattered, that if nothing was missing, nothing required effort. But now he recognized that voice as another form of avoidance. Letting go of striving did not mean withdrawing from life. It meant releasing the story that life must produce a particular outcome in order to justify engagement. One afternoon, Haruto invited him to assist on a short-term project at his firm. It was not a prestigious role. It did not carry a title. It was simply temporary help organizing data for an upcoming presentation. Ren hesitated. The old identity stirred faintly. Director, leader, decision maker. But he saw that clinging to that identity would prevent him from participating in what was actually available. So he accepted. He arrived on Monday morning, sat at a modest desk, and began sorting through spreadsheets. The work was detailed and repetitive. No one deferred to him. No one asked for strategic insight. And yet, as he focused on the task in front of him, he noticed something unexpected. There was satisfaction in simple contribution. He was not building a career. He was not advancing status. He was not proving himself. He was participating. When colleagues thanked him for clarifying confusing sections of the data, he felt appreciation, but it did not inflate into identity. When small mistakes required correction, He adjusted them without defensiveness. He began to understand that the tension he had once felt in ambition did not arise from effort itself. It arose from attachment to outcome. Effort free from that attachment felt clean. Later that week, he returned to the park and found the groundskeeper again. This time the man was repairing a broken section of fence. Ren crouched beside him and picked up a loose plank. They worked quietly for several minutes. Finally, Ren spoke. "I used to think that peace meant doing nothing," he said. The groundskeeper drove a nail into place and smiled. "Peace is not the absence of action," he replied. "It is the absence of struggle within action." Ren let the word settle. Absence of struggle within action. He realized that in his earlier life he had struggled constantly against failure, against uncertainty, against the fear of not being enough. When he tried to escape that struggle, he swung too far in the opposite direction and withdrew entirely. Now he was discovering a middle way. He could act without turning action into identity. He could care without clinging. He could plan without demanding control. In time, he resumed part-time work, not to reclaim status, but to contribute where he felt useful. He maintained friendships with greater attentiveness. He responded to responsibilities promptly, not because they defined him, but because they were his to meet. He noticed that fatigue still came, frustration still arose, disappointment still visited from time to time. Letting go had not eliminated difficulty, but it had removed the additional layer of self-judgment that once accompanied it. He no longer told himself that setbacks proved inadequacy. He no longer told himself that success proved superiority. Experiences passed through him more lightly. One evening, as he walked home after finishing the temporary project, he reflected on the subtle shift that had taken place over the past months. He had begun by chasing achievement. He had swung toward disengagement. Now he was learning to stand in between, to live fully without gripping life too tightly. The streetlights flickered on as dusk settled. He paused at a crosswalk and felt the cool air against his face. Nothing extraordinary marked the moment. Cars passed. People hurried by. The city continued its rhythm, and he stood within it, not striving to rise above it, not retreating from it, but participating quietly. He understood at last that letting go was not an escape from responsibility. It was freedom within responsibility. Freedom from the story that action must complete him. Freedom from the fear that inaction might erase him. With that understanding, he stepped forward as the light changed. Not driven, not withdrawn, simply present. And that presence was enough. When we learn to act without clinging, something subtle begins to mature within us. We no longer chase identity. We no longer withdraw from responsibility. We no longer demand that life complete us. Yet even in this balance, there is still one quiet habit that often remains. We believe that peace must be protected. Once we taste calm, we try to preserve it. Once we discover presence, we fear losing it. Once we feel aligned, we begin guarding that alignment as though it were fragile, and in that guarding, tension quietly returns. Beginner's mind is not something to secure. It is something to allow. There was once a woman who had finally found a sense of inner balance after many years of confusion. Her relationships improved, her work felt steady, her days moved with ease. But when unexpected hardship entered her life, she panicked. She believed her peace was breaking. It took that disruption for her to understand that true steadiness does not depend on circumstances remaining gentle. It lives deeper than comfort. Let us continue. After years of uncertainty and inner restlessness, May had finally found a rhythm that felt steady. Her mornings began quietly. She woke before sunrise, sat for a few minutes in silence, and allowed the day to unfold without rushing ahead of it. She worked at a small design studio where expectations were clear and manageable. She maintained a few close friendships rather than many scattered ones. Even her evenings carried a softness, reading, walking, simple meals prepared without haste. For the first time in her adult life, she felt balanced. She did not describe it as happiness. It was something gentler, a quiet stability beneath daily fluctuations. When small problems arose, she handled them without drama. When misunderstandings occurred, she responded calmly. She had learned not to cling to outcomes, not to chase perfection, not to measure herself relentlessly. And because this steadiness had come after so much effort, she began to value it deeply, perhaps too deeply. When a colleague criticized one of her projects unexpectedly, she felt a sharp contraction in her chest. The criticism was not severe. It was part of normal collaboration. Yet her reaction surprised her. She did not feel anger. She felt fear. What if I am losing my balance? The thought appeared quickly. Over the following weeks, similar disruptions occurred. A close friend moved away. A family disagreement resurfaced. A client withdrew from a contract without warning. Each event was ordinary in isolation, but together, they unsettled her, carefully cultivated calm. She began monitoring herself. Am I still centered? Am I responding properly? Why does this bother me more than it should? The more she tried to maintain her composure, the more strained it became. She noticed that she was resisting discomfort more intensely than before. When irritation surfaced, she suppressed it quickly. When sadness appeared, she tried to reason it away. Peace, which had once felt natural, now felt fragile. One evening, after an argument with her brother that left her unexpectedly shaken, she sat alone in her apartment and realized how exhausted she felt. Not from the argument itself, but from trying to protect her calm. She had begun treating peace as something that must not be disturbed, as though inner steadiness were a delicate object that could shatter under pressure. The next morning, instead of sitting in meditation as she usually did, she remained standing by the window. Her thoughts were restless, her breath uneven. Normally, she would try to settle them. Now she did not. She allowed the restlessness to move through her without correction. It felt uncomfortable, unstable, but beneath the instability she sensed something familiar. The same awareness that had been present during calm was also present during agitation. The surface had changed, the depth had not. Later that week, she visited an older neighbor named Hana, a woman known in the building for her quiet wisdom. May confessed her frustration. I thought I had finally found peace, she said. Now it feels like it is slipping away. Hana listened without interruption. When May finished, Hana smiled gently. You are trying to hold the sky still, she said. May frowned slightly. I don't understand. Calm comes and goes, Hana replied. Just like clouds, you cannot protect the sky by chasing the clouds away. May sat quietly with the image. She realized that she had mistaken calm weather for the sky itself. She had attached to the feeling of steadiness and tried to preserve it. But steadiness did not mean the absence of change. It meant trust within change. Over the next days, she experimented gently. When irritation surfaced, she did not label it as failure. When sadness appeared, she did not treat it as regression. When anxiety flickered, she did not rush to restore calm. Instead, she noticed that each state moved on its own, like weather passing through a wide sky. The fear of losing peace began to soften. She saw that what she truly valued was not constant calm. It was the openness that allowed both calm and disturbance to arise. Her earlier steadiness had not been wrong, but her attempt to preserve it had introduced tension. Peace was not something to guard. It was something that revealed itself when guarding ceased. One evening, after a long day filled with both frustration and laughter, she returned home and sat once more in silence. Her mind was not perfectly still. Her emotions were not entirely settled. Yet beneath the movement, she felt the same quiet presence she had once believed depended on calm conditions. It had never left. Only her expectation had changed. For the first time, she understood that protecting peace is another form of clinging. And true steadiness does not require protection at all. It is wide enough to include the storm. After a conversation with Hannah, May began to observe her inner weather with less urgency. She did not attempt to create calm. She did not attempt to eliminate disturbance. Instead, she grew curious about how each state moved on its own. One morning, she woke with heaviness in her chest. A difficult conversation from the day before lingered in her thoughts. Previously, she would have sat down immediately to meditate, determined to restore equilibrium. This time, she remained in bed for a few extra moments and simply felt the heaviness. It pulsed, it shifted, it softened slightly when she did not resist it. She noticed that discomfort, when unopposed, did not solidify. It behaved like wind passing through open space. At work later that day, another challenge appeared. A client rejected a proposal she had worked on for weeks. Her body reacted before her mind could interpret the situation. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders lifted. She recognized the familiar impulse: protect the calm, stay composed, do not lose balance. But instead of tightening further, she paused. The tension was there, so was awareness of the tension. She answered the client with clarity and professionalism. She revised the proposal where necessary. She did not suppress her disappointment, nor did she dramatize it. The experience passed. That evening, she realized something subtle but profound. Previously, she believed peace meant preventing disruption. Now she saw that peace meant not being thrown away by disruption. The sky does not resist the storm. It does not tighten against thunder. It remains wide. In the following weeks, life continued to present fluctuations. Her brother apologized for their argument, and warmth returned. A new opportunity emerged at work, bringing excitement. Then a minor illness confined her to bed for several days, reminding her again that stability is not constant. Each time she watched the movement, excitement rose, fatigue arrived, irritation flickered, joy expanded. None of it stayed. What stayed was the space in which it appeared. She began to trust that space more than any particular state. One afternoon, she returned to Hannah's apartment with a small box of tea as a thank you. "I think I understand," May said as they sat together. "I was trying to protect something that was never actually fragile." Hannah smiled. "The sky was never in danger," she replied. May laughed softly. She had believed that her calm required maintenance, like a garden constantly trimmed and defended. Now she saw that calm was simply one form the sky could take. The sky did not belong to the clouds. Peace did not belong to quiet days. Her steadiness did not depend on perfect circumstances. As the seasons shifted, she found herself less preoccupied with whether she felt balanced. She no longer measured her progress by the absence of difficulty. Instead, she noticed how quickly she returned to presence after being shaken. Recovery mattered more than prevention. Openness mattered more than control. One evening, as rain struck her window in heavy bursts, she sat without attempting to interpret the sound as soothing or disruptive. It was simply rain. Inside, thoughts moved, emotions moved, and something unmoving held them. She realized that protecting peace had been another subtle strategy of the self, another attempt to secure permanence in a changing world. When she released that strategy, she did not become indifferent. She became resilient. The next time conflict arose, she did not panic at the first sign of discomfort. The next time joy filled her chest, she did not cling to it anxiously. She allowed both, and in allowing both, she experienced a steadiness deeper than calm. Not a still lake untouched by wind, but a vast sky in which wind, rain, and sunlight could all appear without threat. As she prepared for sleep that night, she no longer asked whether she had maintained her peace. She asked only whether she had remained open. The answer was simple: yes, and that was enough. As this journey comes to a close, there is nothing more you need to understand, nothing more to solve, nothing more to improve. If any part of these stories stays with you, let it be this: you do not need to become someone else in order to be at peace. You do not need to hold tightly to certainty, identity, or even calm itself. Beginner's mind is not something to achieve. It is something you return to again and again each time you loosen your grip and allow this moment to be enough. Thank you for spending this time here with us at the long night. If these quiet reflections support your rest, you are welcome to return whenever you need stillness or simply a gentle reminder that nothing is missing. Now let the stories fade. Let the mind soften. Let sleep come naturally. And may your night be deep, peaceful, and undisturbed. Good night.